Hello and welcome. I know many of you use these videos to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where you're from and at what time you're watching. Take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let yourself unwind. Name of the story: The Train That Never Stops. The late-night city streets were quieter than usual. The usual hum of traffic, the distant chatter of pedestrians, and the glow of streetlights all faded as Thomas made his way down the sidewalk. He had just finished a long day at work, and all he wanted now was to get home. His apartment, small and cramped, was a refuge after the long shifts at the office. The world outside never stopped moving, but Thomas found peace in the stillness of his place. Tonight, however, he was feeling a little more on edge than usual. He glanced at his watch. The hour was late, well past midnight. The last train from the downtown station was always a little quieter. He preferred it that way, though. Fewer people meant fewer distractions. And besides, after a long day, he just wanted to be alone with his thoughts. As he approached the station, the dimly lit platform looked almost deserted. Only a few commuters stood, their faces tired and vacant, as if the world outside was too much to handle. Thomas quickly bought his ticket from the kiosk, feeling the chill of the night air creeping down his neck. The station seemed emptier than usual. There was a strange heaviness in the air tonight, as if something was waiting to happen, but he shrugged it off. He had a train to catch, and that's all that mattered. The train pulled into the station with a soft hiss, its headlights casting a long, eerie shadow on the platform. It was an old model, clunky, with faded red paint that made it look like something from another era. Thomas didn't think much of it at first, except for a fleeting thought that it looked out of place. It seemed almost too ancient, but he was too tired to care. He boarded the train, stepping into a nearly empty car. A single man sat in the far corner, staring out the window, his face hidden beneath the brim of a dark hat. Thomas glanced at him, but quickly turned away. There was something about the man's stillness that unsettled him, but again, he pushed the feeling aside. He found a seat by the window and leaned back, staring out into the darkness as the train began to move. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks was oddly soothing, and Thomas felt his eyes grow heavy. His head lulled to one side, and for a moment he almost fell asleep. The train moved steadily through the city, but as the minutes passed, something strange began to happen. It wasn't anything major, just small oddities that made Thomas's brow furrow. He could have sworn the train had already passed a few stations, but the signs on the platform never changed. The stops seemed to repeat themselves in an endless loop. He checked his watch, noting that the time had barely changed. Must be tired, he thought. Maybe I'm just not paying attention. But the feeling wouldn't go away. The night had an oppressive quality to it now, as if the train was moving through a world that no longer existed. The air inside the car felt thick, heavy, as if something was pressing down on him. He shifted in his seat, uncomfortable, and glanced over at the man in the corner. The stranger still hadn't moved, his eyes fixed on the window. There was something deeply unsettling about his stillness. Thomas opened his mouth to say something, to ask if everything was all right, but the words never left his lips. It was as though his voice had been swallowed by the thick air inside the train. A sudden chill ran down his spine. He looked around the car again, his gaze catching on a few more figures now. There were others seated in the car, but they were different. Their eyes were too wide, too blank. Their clothes were old-fashioned, as though they didn't belong to the present time. Thomas's heart began to race, a rising wave of panic crawling up his throat. He quickly turned back to the window. The city outside had disappeared, replaced by an endless stretch of darkened landscape. The train no longer seemed to be moving through a real place. It was as if the outside world was just gone. The stranger in the corner finally shifted, slowly raising his head. He turned his gaze towards Thomas, and for the first time, their eyes met. Thomas froze. There was nothing human in the stranger's eyes, nothing warm or alive. They were hollow, black pits, empty and endless, as though staring into them would pull him into a void he couldn't escape. "Where are we going?" Thomas finally managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. The stranger didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let out a low chuckle, a sound that sent a shiver of dread through Thomas's entire body. "Nowhere," the man said, his voice raspy and dry, like leaves crunching in the wind. "This train never stops." The words hung in the air, an unsettling truth settling around them like fog. Thomas opened his mouth to ask what the man meant, but before he could speak, the train lurched. The lights flickered, casting shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally along the walls of the car. The steady rhythm of the wheels began to slow, the air growing colder. And then, for the first time since he had boarded, Thomas noticed something even stranger. The train had stopped moving. The eerie stillness inside the car was suffocating. He looked around again at the other passengers, but they were all staring at him now. Their eyes were wide, unblinking, and lifeless. He could hear the faintest whispers coming from the corners of the car, voices that were not his own, and certainly not from anyone else aboard the train. The temperature dropped further. He could see his breath fogging in the air, thick and unnatural. Panic rose in his chest as he stood up, heart hammering in his chest. "What's happening?" he muttered, his voice trembling. No one answered. He stumbled toward the door, his hands shaking as he reached for the handle. He yanked on it with all his strength, but the door wouldn't open. It felt as if something on the other side was holding it shut, keeping him trapped inside. "What the hell is going on?" he shouted, banging on the glass. "Let me off!" But the train didn't respond. No one did. The whispers grew louder, more insistent now, swirling around him like a storm. His head spun as his mind raced for an explanation, but nothing made sense. The train had stopped moving, yet it felt like it was still going. His stomach churned with a growing sense of dread, and his hands were clammy with sweat. Suddenly a voice, clear and sharp, cut through the air. "Get off!" Thomas whipped around, his breath catching in his throat. The voice came from the far end of the car, from the shadowy figure sitting there. The man who had been silent before now stood. His features were clearer than ever, and there was no mistaking the malicious grin stretching across his face. His teeth were too white, too sharp, and there was a deep, unsettling glint in his eyes. "Get off!" the man repeated, stepping forward. But Thomas had no idea how. The air around Thomas seemed to constrict, as if the train itself were breathing, drawing him deeper into some unseen pit. His pulse quickened, each beat of his heart pounding in his ears. The whispering voices, those soft, maddening murmurs, grew louder, overlapping one another in a cacophony of disembodied sounds. His head throbbed with the pressure of them, his stomach twisting into tight knots. The stranger's figure moved closer, and Thomas felt an overwhelming urge to run, though he couldn't decide where he could possibly go. The train was endless, the walls a smooth, reflective surface that seemed to stretch on forever, no exits, no doors to speak of. "Get off," the man repeated. This time, the words were sharp, almost like a command. Thomas turned back to the door. He yanked on the handle again, his fingers numb and slick with sweat. The door didn't budge. He kicked at it, his foot slamming against the glass with a sickening thud. But there was no sound, no echo of impact. It was as though the room had swallowed it whole. "Why won't it open?" Thomas gasped, more to himself than to anyone else. His voice was tight, strained, as if the air was being sucked out of his lungs. The man didn't answer. He just stood there, staring, his eyes too wide, too unblinking, as if he could see straight into Thomas's very soul. The train's lights flickered again, casting long, creeping shadows that stretched across the floor and up the walls, making the space feel even more suffocating. "Get off!" the voices whispered, growing more frantic. "Get off before it's too late." Thomas took a step back, his breath shallow, his hands trembling. The temperature had dropped even further, so much so that he could see his breath forming misty clouds in front of him. The cold crept into his bones, stealing his warmth, his strength, and yet it was the whispers that filled him with the most dread. They weren't just in his ears anymore. They were inside his head, buzzing beneath his skin, whispering to him like 1,000 voices all at once. He wanted to scream, to shout at them, to demand answers, but he couldn't. It was as if something was preventing him from speaking, holding his voice in his throat. The train was alive with this presence. The whole thing, every seat, every inch of metal and glass, felt wrong. The stranger took another slow step forward, and Thomas could feel the air grow even colder, like the temperature had dropped several degrees with each movement. It wasn't the cold of winter. It was a coldness that seemed to seep from the very walls of the train, from the floor beneath his feet. "Where are we?" Thomas finally managed to rasp out, his voice sounding small and distant. The stranger's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't comforting. It was predatory, something that had no place in a human face. "Does it matter?" he asked in a voice that felt too hollow, too distant, as though it came from some far-off place. Before Thomas could respond, the whispering voices intensified, coming from all directions now. They were everywhere. They were inside his head, inside his chest, suffocating him. "It's not real. None of this is real. You'll never escape. You belong here." Each whisper was louder, clearer than the last, and they swirled around him, tugging at his mind, drowning out his thoughts. He clutched his head, trying to block them out, but they pressed harder, the weight of them driving him to the edge of madness. "Stop!" he screamed, his voice echoing through the train. But it didn't stop. The voices only grew louder, more insistent. He could hear them now, each individual whisper distinct, and each one a dark, terrible warning. "They've been here before. They'll never leave, and neither will you." Thomas stumbled back, his body hitting the cold wall of the train, sending a shock of ice through him. His heart raced in his chest, and he fought to steady his breath. He needed to get out. He couldn't stay in here. But how? How could he escape when the train wouldn't stop? In desperation, he turned toward the window, hands shaking as he peered out into the night. But instead of the usual blurred lights and signs of the city, there was only an endless void. The night had swallowed the world whole. There was no skyline, no stars, no landmarks, only an impenetrable, black emptiness that stretched on forever. He stared at it, feeling the very fabric of reality slipping away from him. What was this place? Where was he? He couldn't see any signs of life outside the window. No passing scenery, no lights blinking in the distance. Just the same endless black. The train jerked forward again, this time with an unsettling violence, the sudden motion making Thomas stumble. He grabbed onto the nearest seat to steady himself. His hands were slick with sweat, his heart beating faster than it ever had before. This wasn't just a train ride. This wasn't just some late-night commute. This was something else. Something alive. The train is moving again, he thought, his mind struggling to make sense of it all. But where is it going? He turned back to the other passengers, looking for someone, anyone, who might be able to explain what was happening. But they were all staring at him now, their eyes wide and unblinking, hollow. They weren't blinking, they weren't moving, not even breathing. They were just watching. He swallowed hard, his throat tight with fear. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice cracking, barely audible. The man in the corner, the one who had first spoken to him, began to move again, slowly, deliberately. He took a few slow steps, his movements unnaturally smooth, like he was gliding rather than walking. And as he did, the other passengers followed suit, all of them standing in perfect unison. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. The stranger's lips twisted into that smile again, the one that sent a chill down Thomas's spine. "You should have gotten off when you had the chance," the man said softly. The words were like a low hum, like a warning. "But now you're part of this train, and it's not stopping." Thomas's mind spun. He couldn't move. He couldn't think. His body was frozen in place, his heart thundering in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to run, to fight, to do anything. But he couldn't. He was trapped. The train continued to rattle through the empty night, its screeching wheels an eerie soundtrack to the growing dread that gripped Thomas. He could feel the weight of the passengers' unblinking eyes upon him, like 1,000 invisible hands pushing him deeper into a nightmare that had no end. The man who had spoken to him, the one with the predatory smile, now stood at the center of the car, his body perfectly still, but his eyes were alive with something that Thomas couldn't quite name. What do you want from me?" Thomas managed to whisper, the words barely escaping his dry throat. His mouth felt like sandpaper, his lips cracking with the effort to speak. The stranger took a slow, deliberate step forward, his expression never changing. "Want," he repeated, his voice a low rasp. "You misunderstand. This train does not want anything from you. It needs you." Thomas's stomach twisted into a knot. The words sent a shiver up his spine, but he didn't dare look away. The man's gaze seemed to pierce through him, unraveling his very thoughts, digging deep into his past, as though it knew every fear, every regret, every weakness. "I don't understand," Thomas mumbled, his mind reeling, struggling to grasp what was happening. He was trapped in this train, with these passengers who weren't alive, surrounded by an endless void. The fear in his chest rose, clawing at his lungs, suffocating him. "You will," the stranger replied softly, stepping closer now, the gap between them closing with every breath. "You will understand soon enough. When the time comes." Thomas tried to back away, but the train's movement was erratic, jerking forward again. His knees buckled under him, and he fell to the floor with a dull thud. The cold, unfeeling metal pressed into his skin as he lay there, too frightened to move. His heart hammered in his chest, each beat louder than the last, drowning out everything else. The whispers had returned, crawling into his ears, into his very soul. They spoke in a language he couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a voice of warning, a voice that wanted him to listen, to accept. "You are here now. You belong here. There is no escape. Not anymore. The train is hungry." He clutched his ears, trying to block them out, but the voices only grew louder, more urgent, more insistent. Suddenly, the train lurched forward with an alarming force, throwing Thomas into the seat beside him. His breath caught in his throat as the motion seemed to become more erratic, almost frantic. The lights flickered, casting long shadows across the car, creating twisted shapes on the walls that seemed to shift and change. For a moment, Thomas thought he saw figures, tall, elongated shadows that slithered and moved in ways that made no sense. Is this real?" Thomas whispered, his mind cracking under the pressure of the overwhelming sensations. The cold air was unbearable now, cutting into his skin like sharp blades. His body shook uncontrollably, his heart pounding against his ribs. The stranger was standing right in front of him now, his face close, too close. "What's real?" the man asked, his voice almost mocking, though there was an eerie sadness in his eyes. Thomas looked around desperately, his gaze landing on the other passengers. They still stood in eerie silence, not a single one of them making a move. But something had changed. They were no longer just standing there, motionless. Their eyes were now fixed on Thomas, their mouths twitching, stretching into grotesque smiles. His stomach churned, and the world seemed to tilt. The train felt as though it were spinning, but the walls were still there, the reflections warping and bending in a sickening way. He blinked, but when he opened his eyes, the faces of the passengers had changed. Their features were melting, becoming distorted, as if they weren't even human anymore. Their eyes were wide, empty voids, and their mouths were stretched open in silent screams. No, this can't be happening." The whispers grew louder, and now they were coming from the passengers too, their voices merging with the others, forming a low hum that seemed to vibrate in his chest. "You're part of us now. Forever. No one leaves. He stood, trembling, his body moving without his consent, as if the train itself were controlling him, guiding his every step. His legs wobbled beneath him, but he couldn't stop himself from walking toward the front of the car, toward the door that would not open. He reached for the handle again, but it was useless. The door was locked in place, as it always had been. There was no way out. No escape. "You've been here before," the stranger said suddenly, his voice sharp, cutting through Thomas's panic. "You've always been here." "What do you mean?" Thomas stammered, his breath ragged, the fear threatening to swallow him whole. The man's smile widened, and for a brief moment, Thomas could have sworn the man's teeth were too sharp, too many. "You're not the first to board this train. You won't be the last. And in the end, we all find our way here. The train chooses you." Thomas's pulse quickened. "No, I don't belong here. I don't know how I got here. Please, just let me go." The man tilted his head, his expression softening for the first time, though there was no kindness in it. Only pity. "You're here because you were meant to be. This train doesn't stop for anyone. Not for you. Not for anyone. It's your fate." Fate. The word echoed in Thomas's mind, gnawing at him, digging deep into the cracks of his sanity. Was this some twisted dream? Some nightmare he couldn't wake up from? Or had it always been this way, and he had just never realized it? The train lurched forward again, and this time it didn't stop. It didn't slow. It was as if it had entered another dimension, one where time had no meaning, no end. The walls seemed to bend and twist, the passengers' faces changing again, becoming something other, something monstrous. The air grew thick with their whispers, each voice blending into the next, creating a chorus of despair. And then, in the distance, Thomas saw something. A flicker of light. A sign. A station. Could it be real? Was it possible that the train was finally stopping? He stumbled toward the window, his heart in his throat, and peered outside. But when he saw the station, his breath caught. The platform was empty. The buildings were crumbling, the streets dark and desolate. The entire place was dead. And the more he stared, the more he realized that the station wasn't just deserted. It wasn't a real place at all. It was another reflection. The train wasn't moving toward the station. It was moving toward its destination. And Thomas realized with a sickening certainty that the train would never stop. Not for him. Not for anyone. The realization hit Thomas like a cold wave, crashing over him, submerging him in panic and despair. The station outside the window wasn't real. It was just another illusion, another trick of the train. His fingers pressed against the glass, the cool surface offering no comfort. His eyes were wide, desperate, searching for some sign of escape, some glimmer of hope. But there was nothing, only darkness stretching out endlessly, and the faint hum of the train's engine that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. He backed away from the window, his breath shallow, his heart pounding. The passengers were still standing around him, their twisted forms shifting in the dim light. Their eyes never left him, their smiles wide and grotesque. He could hear their whispers now, clearer than ever before. The voices weren't just words, they were feelings, thoughts, memories that weren't his own. "Come closer. You can't leave. You're one of us now. There's no way out. Not anymore. We've been waiting for you." Thomas felt his skin crawl as the whispers grew louder, pressing in on him from all sides. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body wouldn't move. It felt like the train itself was holding him in place, forcing him to stand, to listen, to accept. He looked around, trying to focus on anything that wasn't those eyes, those smiles, but it was impossible. The air was thick, suffocating. The walls seemed to close in around him. "Why me?" Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible over the rising chorus of whispers. "Why did it choose me?" The man with the sharp smile stepped closer, his dark eyes gleaming in the dim light. "It doesn't choose," he said softly. "You're already here. You've always been here." Thomas recoiled, shaking his head. I don't understand. I don't belong here. The man's smile stretched wider, almost impossibly so. That's what they all say, he replied, his voice a cold whisper. In the end, you'll realize that the train never needed you to belong. It only needed you to stay. As the man spoke, the other passengers seemed to come alive, moving around Thomas in slow, deliberate circles. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like marionettes with their strings cut. Some of them reached out, their skeletal hands brushing against his arms, their cold touch sending a shiver of fear deep into his bones. Thomas staggered back, his heart racing, his legs weak beneath him. I can't stay here, he cried, but the words felt empty, meaningless. It was as if the train itself had swallowed his voice, drowned out his pleas with the relentless noise of the wheels screeching against the tracks. The man with the smile, his eyes glinting with something ancient, leaned in close, his breath hot against Thomas's ear. You have no choice, he whispered. None of us do. We're all bound here, just like you will be. Forever. The words settled in Thomas's chest like a stone. He shook his head, disoriented, trying to make sense of it all. The train was endless. The passengers were ghosts, or worse. And the man, he wasn't human. No, none of them were. He could feel it now, deep in his bones. The very air around him seemed to hum with a malevolent energy, as if the train itself were alive, watching him, waiting. The train jerked again, its movements becoming more erratic, more frenzied. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. For a moment, everything seemed to blur, as though reality itself was slipping out of focus. The walls of the train car twisted and bent, the reflections warping into grotesque shapes that flickered in and out of view. Make it stop, Thomas begged, his voice breaking. But the man only smiled. It will never stop. This train doesn't have a destination, Thomas. It's a journey with no end. The passengers closed in around him now, their eyes gleaming with something ancient, something hungry. Thomas could feel the weight of their gaze, their empty stares crawling beneath his skin, making his heart race in his chest. They weren't just watching him, they were waiting for him to break, to give in. I won't give in, Thomas said, his voice trembling but defiant. I won't be like you. The man's smile faltered for a split second, his eyes darkening with something like amusement. You think you have a choice? You think you can resist? His voice was low, mocking. The train always wins. In the end, we all do. The whispers grew louder, more intense, swirling around him like a storm. The voices were no longer just words. They were emotions, memories, images from his past. He saw glimpses of his life flashing before his eyes, his family, his childhood, moments of joy and pain. But it wasn't just his life. It was everyone's life, the passengers' lives. They were all here, all a part of this twisted ride. They had all been pulled into the train, just like him. You're part of the train now. You'll never leave. We've been waiting for you. Always. You'll never escape. The words twisted in his mind, warping his thoughts, pulling him deeper into the darkness. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to obey. He was trapped, shackled by fear, by the whispers, by the very train itself. There was no escape. Let me go, he shouted, his voice rising in desperation. Please, I want to get off. I want to wake up. The man with the smile stepped forward, his eyes burning with an intensity that made Thomas's blood run cold. There is no waking up, he said, his voice calm, almost pitying. This is your reality now. The train is your reality. You'll never leave, Thomas. And neither will any of us. The air grew thick with the hum of the train's engine, the vibrations shaking the walls, rattling Thomas's bones. The whispers seemed to echo louder, until it felt like his mind was being consumed by the noise. The walls of the train car began to close in on him, the space growing smaller, suffocating. The passengers were no longer just standing. They were moving toward him, their hands outstretched, their eyes wide and unblinking. And then in the distance, a flicker of light appeared, a distant station perhaps. Thomas's heart raced, hope rising within him, but as the train drew closer, he saw the truth. The station wasn't real. It was just another reflection, another trap set by the train to lure him in. The train never stopped. It never would, and neither would he. The train rattled on, its wheels screeching against the tracks as if mocking Thomas's helplessness. The fleeting glimmer of hope he'd felt when he saw the distant station had already faded, swallowed by the endless darkness. The walls of the train seemed to pulse around him, the air thickening with the weight of his own dread. The passengers, those twisted reflections of people once alive, moved closer, their eyes gleaming with an unsettling hunger. Thomas stumbled back, his pulse racing, his mind spiraling. The realization, heavy and inescapable, gnawed at him. The train wasn't just a machine. It was something far older, far more sinister. It wasn't merely taking him on a ride. It was feeding off his fear, consuming him with every passing second. The train had no destination, no end. It existed for one purpose: to trap, to consume, and to make its passengers part of its eternal journey. "I won't give up," Thomas whispered to himself, his voice shaking. But even as the words left his lips, he knew they were empty. His mind was unraveling, and the overwhelming sense of dread that gripped him only tightened with every second. "Why are you fighting?" a voice purred, slithering through the air like a snake. It came from behind him, smooth and seductive. He spun around to see the woman with dark, vacant eyes, her long hair falling over her face. Her expression was empty, a hollow mask of beauty that seemed to hide something far more monstrous beneath. "Why don't you just accept it?" she continued, her voice almost sweet, like a lullaby that promised no escape. "We've all been here for so long. You don't need to resist. You can be with us forever." Thomas recoiled, his stomach churning. "I don't want to be like you," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You're all dead." The woman tilted her head slightly, an eerie smile curling at the edges of her lips. "Dead," she echoed, her laughter soft and unsettling. "We're not dead, Thomas. We're just not alive, not in the way you think. We exist. We endure. And so will you once you stop fighting." Her words were like poison, sliding beneath his skin, planting seeds of doubt in his mind. How could he resist when everything felt so hopeless? How could he escape when the walls of the train seemed to close in, pressing on him, suffocating him? His thoughts raced, but every thought led back to the same cold, harsh truth: there was no escape. The passengers were closing in now, their hollow eyes locked onto him with unblinking intensity. They were too close. He could hear the soft scrape of their feet against the floor, the faint whispers of their voices blending into an unintelligible murmur. The train's hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing moment. "Stop," Thomas cried, his voice raw. "Leave me alone." The woman stepped forward, her fingers brushing lightly against his arm. Her touch was cold, like the icy grip of death itself. "You're not the first to try," she whispered, her voice dipping into something darker, more sinister. "You won't be the last. We all thought we could escape, at first." Her words were like daggers, stabbing into his mind, digging deeper into the place where his fear lay. He wanted to run. He wanted to scream, but his body felt numb, as if it too had been claimed by the train. The walls of the car seemed to close in tighter, the space shrinking with every breath. "No," he yelled, slamming his fist against the wall, the sound echoing in the hollow emptiness. "I'm not like you. I won't stay here. I'll get out." For a brief moment, the woman's smile faltered. Her eyes flickered, a hint of something darker flashing behind them. "You still don't understand," she said softly, her voice low and almost pitying. "You're already here, Thomas. You've been here longer than you think." Thomas's breath caught in his throat as he felt a cold chill creep down his spine. What did she mean? What was she trying to say? "Stop it," he shouted, backing away, his mind spinning. "I'm not like you. I won't stay here forever." But as the words left his lips, something shifted. The train's lights flickered again, and the walls seemed to pulse, as if the very structure of the train was alive, responding to his defiance. The passengers, no, the creatures, slowly began to gather around him, their empty eyes never leaving him. Their whispers were louder now, the words blending together into a single, maddening chant. You belong to the train. You can't leave. We're all here. We're all waiting. The whispers felt like hands, clawing at his mind, pulling him into their embrace. It was too much, too overwhelming. His legs gave way beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor, his hands pressed against his ears in a desperate attempt to block out the maddening sound. You can't block us out, the woman's voice echoed, her tone filled with a cruel amusement. We're inside you now, Thomas, just like the rest of us. You're part of the train. The words reverberated through his skull, sinking deep into his consciousness. The train's hum seemed to drown out everything else, the rhythmic pounding of the wheels against the tracks merging with the whispers, the chants, until it was all he could hear. He tried to stand, to run, but his body refused to obey. He was trapped, his legs stiff, his arms frozen by an invisible force. He could feel his mind unraveling, the edges of his sanity fraying as the darkness closed in around him. And then, as if from a distance, a voice broke through the chaos. It was faint, weak, but it was there. Thomas! He lifted his head, trying to focus on the sound. Was it a voice from the outside world? Could it be? Thomas, you need to wake up. The voice was faint, like a whisper on the wind, but it was different from the others. It didn't belong to the creatures in the train. It didn't belong to the train at all. Wake up, Thomas. It's not too late. The voice seemed to reach him, cutting through the haze of whispers, pulling him back from the edge of insanity. He could feel a flicker of something real. His heart raced, a new surge of adrenaline pushing through his veins. Was this an illusion too? Or was it his last chance? Without thinking, he pushed himself up, his legs trembling beneath him. The creatures were closing in, their hands reaching for him, but the voice, that voice, pushed him forward. Wake up, wake up! Thomas ran. His feet pounded against the floor of the train, his heart racing as he darted between the passengers, their grotesque figures a blur. The walls seemed to close in around him, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. There was no time to think. He had to escape. And then, just as the shadows reached for him, a door appeared. Thomas's heart raced as he saw the door materialize out of thin air, its wooden frame sharp against the sickly glow of the train's dim lighting. It hadn't been there a moment ago, but now it stood, as real and solid as any other door. The whispers intensified, a deafening cacophony surrounding him, but his eyes locked onto the door with a fierce determination. This was his chance. It was the only way out. He bolted towards it, his legs burning with the effort, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The creatures behind him screeched, their fingers clawing at the air, their eyes wild with hunger. They were too close, too many. He could feel their cold, dead gazes on his back, and he knew, if he slowed down for even a second, they would catch him, drag him back into the endless dark of the train. The door was closer now, the space between him and it narrowing with every step. It loomed ahead like a beacon of hope, its brass handle gleaming in the dim light. He reached for it, his hand shaking violently, but just as his fingers brushed against the cold metal, something grabbed his ankle. A sharp, searing pain shot through his leg as a cold hand, clammy and thin like decaying flesh, tightened around his foot. He cried out, struggling to free himself, but the grip only tightened. He tried kicking, twisting, anything to break free, but the hand was unyielding. A low, guttural laugh echoed from behind him, and he whipped his head around to see the woman, her face contorted in a twisted grin, her hollow eyes gleaming with sadistic pleasure. "Where do you think you're going?" she cooed, her voice soft but sharp, like a blade sliding across skin. "You can't leave. None of us ever can." "No!" Thomas screamed, his voice breaking. "I won't stay here." But the woman's grin only widened, her features becoming more distorted. as if her face was being pulled into something darker, more monstrous. The air around them seemed to crackle with an unnatural energy, the walls of the train closing in tighter, pressing on his chest, suffocating him. But Thomas wasn't done. He wouldn't give up. He wasn't like them. He refused to be swallowed by this nightmare. His other foot kicked out violently, striking the edge of the door frame. The impact sent a jolt through his leg, but it also dislodged the hand around his ankle. For a brief moment, the woman's grip loosened, and Thomas yanked his leg free. He stumbled forward, his body unsteady, but he wasn't about to stop now. With one final desperate effort, Thomas grabbed the door handle. It felt impossibly cold beneath his fingers, as if it had been frozen by the depths of the void itself, but he twisted it with all his strength. The door creaked open, revealing only darkness beyond. There was no light, no sign of anything, just a thick, suffocating blackness that seemed to pull at him like a vortex. "Don't," the woman whispered from behind him, her voice dripping with malice. "You'll regret it." He didn't care. The whispers that had once filled the air were now just a dull buzz in his ears. The only sound that mattered was his heartbeat, pounding in his chest, louder than anything else. He stepped through the door. The moment he crossed the threshold, the air shifted. The oppressive weight of the train lifted, replaced by something else, a chilling cold, a silence so profound it felt unnatural. It was as though the world itself had been swallowed by the void, leaving only the barest echo of what had been. He stumbled, his feet crunching against something cold and sharp, like glass underfoot. His hands shot out to catch himself, but there was nothing to hold on to, nothing to steady him. Thomas forced himself to his feet, his breath clouding in the frigid air. He couldn't see anything beyond the darkness, couldn't tell where the train had gone, or if it had even been real at all. His head spun, the residual effects of fear and exhaustion clouding his thoughts. He had escaped, but where was he now? The silence stretched on, oppressive and heavy. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The train, the woman, the passengers. Was any of it real? Had it been a dream? Or was this part of the nightmare, a new, even darker stage in his torment? "Thomas," the voice came again, faint and distant, but unmistakably real. It was the same voice he had heard before, the one that had called to him, urged him to wake up. It was soft, gentle, but there was something behind it, something desperate, something that sounded familiar. He took a step forward, then another, unsure of where he was going but unable to stand still. The fog around him was thick, and he could barely see his own hand in front of his face. The only thing that remained clear was that voice. "Thomas, you have to wake up." His feet moved faster now, driven by a force he couldn't explain. The cold pressed in on him from all sides, and he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The darkness shifted, pulling, whispering, and the longer he walked, the closer the voice seemed to get. And then suddenly the fog parted, just slightly, enough for him to see something ahead. A faint glow flickered through the mist. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was light. Thomas broke into a run, his legs aching with the effort, the frost biting at his skin. He could hear the whispers again, low and insistent, rising in volume with each step. The closer he got to the light, the more intense the whispers became, until they felt like hands clutching at his mind, pulling him down into the depths of his own fear. But he couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. Not again. Not after everything he had already been through. And then he broke through the fog. The scene before him was like something out of a dream or a nightmare. He stood at the edge of a vast, open plain, the grass beneath his feet dry and brittle, as if untouched by time. In the distance, there was a small house, its windows dark, its door ajar as though inviting him in. The sky above was a deep, bruised purple, streaked with lightning that crackled silently, as though even the storm itself had forgotten how to make a sound. And there, standing at the threshold of the house, was a figure, a silhouette, barely visible against the dim light, but the outline was unmistakable. It was him. His own face stared back at him, but it wasn't a reflection. It wasn't a mirror. It was a person, another version of him, twisted and wrong. "Welcome home, Thomas," the figure said, its voice dripping with mockery. "You should have known there was no escape." Thomas froze, his blood running cold as he stared at the figure that mirrored him perfectly. Yet it wasn't him, not entirely. The figure stood motionless, its arms hanging by its sides like a marionette waiting to be controlled. The longer Thomas stared, the more he saw in it, his own face, but the eyes were black holes, voids that seemed to consume everything in their gaze. A twisted grin stretched across the figure's face, but there was nothing warm or human in it. The grin was sharp, jagged, as if it were carved into the skin. It stepped forward, the earth beneath it groaning, like the ground itself rejected the presence of this thing. Its voice came again, soft but mocking. "You can't escape from yourself, Thomas. We're all trapped here." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow, and for a brief moment, he thought he might collapse. His heart pounded in his chest, the beat quickening with every breath he took. The world around him seemed to warp, the edges of the plane rippling like water disturbed by a stone. "No," Thomas gasped, shaking his head violently. "No, this isn't real. You're not real." But the figure didn't respond with words. Instead, it began to move toward him, its steps slow but deliberate. Every footfall it made was like a drumbeat echoing in Thomas's mind. With every step it took, the air seemed to thicken, the cold seeping deeper into his bones, until it felt like he was standing in a tomb, suffocating under the weight of silence and dread. "Wake up, Thomas," it said again, but this time the words weren't mocking. They were insistent, desperate. "It's time to wake up." He staggered backward, panic clawing at him, but the figure wasn't going to let him go. It reached out with a skeletal hand, its fingers stretching impossibly long, unnaturally so, until they brushed against his arm. The touch was freezing, like the grip of death itself, and Thomas gasped, recoiling from it as if burned. The figure's smile twisted further, its lips peeling back to reveal a row of sharp, black teeth. "You think you're the one in control? You're not. This place, this train, it never stops. And neither will we." Suddenly, Thomas was back on the train. The world snapped around him like a curtain being drawn, and the familiar groan of the train's wheels on the track filled his ears again. He was standing in the same car, the same dimly lit space, the same faded seats and rusting fixtures. The passengers were there, too, their faces as blank and hollow as ever, but their eyes were now fixed on him. Every single one of them watched him, unblinking, as if they knew something he didn't. And in the silence of the train, the whispers started again, but this time they were louder, more insistent. "Join us, Thomas," the whispers hissed in unison. "You'll never leave. You'll never wake up." Thomas stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. He could feel the walls of the train pressing in on him, the air growing heavier, more suffocating with each passing second. He needed to move, needed to get out of here, but every door he tried was sealed shut, every window an impenetrable blur of glass. There was no escape. "No!" Thomas shouted, his voice cracking. "I won't stay here. I won't become like you." He turned, frantically searching for a way out, but the train seemed endless, stretching out before him in all directions. The faces of the passengers twisted, their features warping into grotesque shapes, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. And then he heard it, a soft voice, barely a whisper, but it cut through the cacophony of fear and panic. "Thomas, help me." He spun around, heart leaping in his chest. The voice, it was familiar. He knew it. "Mom," he whispered, barely able to speak the word, the name catching in his throat. There, standing at the far end of the car, was a woman. She was older now, her hair silvered with age, her face lined with the marks of time, but it was unmistakably her, his mother. "Mom," he shouted again, taking a step forward, then another, but each step felt like wading through thick tar, the air growing heavier, more oppressive with every move. She reached out toward him, her hand trembling. "You have to leave, Thomas," she said, her voice low and strained, as if the very act of speaking was a struggle. "You can't stay here. You can't help them." "What are you talking about?" Thomas gasped, his mind spinning. "I don't understand. What's happening? What is this place?" She took a step back, her face crumpling in pain, her hands clutching at her chest as if it physically hurt her to speak. "They'll take you too," she whispered. "Just like they took me. Just like they took everyone. It's too late for me, but it's not too late for you." Before Thomas could move any closer, the train lurched violently, throwing him off balance. The lights flickered, casting everything in an eerie, strobe-like glow. And then the figure appeared again, standing between him and his mother, its eyes glowing a faint, unnatural red. "You can't save her," it said, its voice cold and final. "There is no salvation here. There's only the endless ride. Only the darkness." The train shook again, and the lights went out completely. For a moment, everything was plunged into complete darkness, but the whispers never stopped. They grew louder, more frantic, filling the space around him until it felt like they were crawling under his skin, suffocating him from the inside. "Wake up, Thomas," his mother's voice whispered again, softer this time, as if she was fading. His heart raced, his breathing shallow. He had to make a choice. The voice was calling to him, pleading with him, but the figure, the thing that wasn't him, was blocking the way. "Make the choice," it sneered, stepping closer, its breath cold against his face. "You're running out of time." And then everything went still. For a single brief moment, everything was silent. The whispers stopped. The train stopped. The shadows stopped moving. It was as if time itself had frozen. And in that silence, Thomas felt the weight of it all. The weight of everything he had been through, everything he was about to face, the terror of never waking up again. But in that moment, something else shifted too. A small voice, distant but clear, rang in his mind. A voice that wasn't his mother's. It was his own. "You can escape, Thomas. You can still wake up." Thomas's breath caught in his throat. The voice inside his head. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a figment of his imagination. It was strong, clear, and full of a strange kind of knowing, as if it had been waiting for him to hear it. He took a step back, his gaze darting around the darkened train car. The stillness was overwhelming, oppressive, as if the very air was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. His mother's image had faded. The figure, his reflection or whatever it was, stood silent, its black eyes boring into him. But now, there was a different sense to the moment. The oppressive weight that had crushed him before, that had suffocated his thoughts, seemed to lift ever so slightly. There was a shift, as if something had cracked open just a little. The voice came again, gentle, almost reassuring. "You can break free, Thomas. The choice is yours." The train was still, the rhythmic sound of the tracks absent. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest, but the panic that had gripped him so fiercely now seemed distant. His mother had been taken, lost to this nightmare, but the voice, his voice, was telling him there was still a chance. He could escape this. He could stop this endless ride. But how? The figure, no, the thing, moved toward him again, its movements unnatural, too smooth, too fluid. It didn't walk, it glided. Its form stretched unnaturally tall, its hands, long and clawed, reaching for him. Its mouth twisted into a grotesque sneer, and its voice echoed in the silence, a low, guttural growl. "You think you have control? You think you can break free?" It took another step, its presence filling the air, suffocating him again. "You are already ours. You belong here. We are all trapped." "Stop it!" Thomas shouted, his voice shaking but defiant. The words felt weak against the crushing atmosphere of the train, but the voice in his mind urged him forward. "Remember, Thomas, it's not about fighting them. It's about fighting yourself. Let go of your fear. Let go of the darkness." The words pierced the fog of confusion clouding his mind. He understood now. This wasn't just about escaping the train. It was about escaping the endless loop of terror he had been caught in. The train, the passengers, the figure, it was all a manifestation of his own fears, his own doubts. He had been trapped by his mind, by his inability to confront what lay beneath the surface. His eyes locked with the creatures, and for a moment, time seemed to stretch. The figure's mouth moved, whispering words that made no sense, but they felt like a promise of doom. You cannot escape what you are, what you fear. We will never let you go. His pulse thundered in his ears, but something in his chest stirred, a quiet resistance. It wasn't enough to just escape the train. He had to face what was in front of him. He had to look into the abyss, even if it was the abyss of himself. Suddenly, the train lurched again. The lights flickered back on, harsh and blinding, flooding the car with a brutal, sterile light. Thomas squinted, his eyes burning from the sudden change. When the light stabilized, he saw the car had transformed. The walls were no longer plain and featureless. They were covered in symbols, dark and twisting, crawling like insects across the surface. The windows were now shattered, jagged edges biting into the air, and through the broken glass he could see endless, empty tracks stretching into an abyss that never ended. And then the passengers. They were no longer the still, blank-eyed figures they had been before. Now they were writhing, twisting in their seats, their faces contorting in agony, mouths open as if screaming, but no sound escaped. Their eyes were wide and filled with terror, their hands clawing at the seat, at their own faces, at anything they could reach. Thomas's stomach twisted. This was it, the manifestation of the curse. The endless train, the endless passengers, the endless fear. They were all bound here, caught by the same fate that threatened to claim him as well. The thing, the creature, was still there, its black eyes now glistening with a strange, cruel amusement. It didn't need to speak. Its mere presence was enough to freeze him in place. But Thomas, heart-pounding, clenched his fists. The time for fear was over. "I'm not like you," Thomas whispered, barely audible at first, but the words gained strength. "I will not stay here. I will escape." The creature tilted its head, its grin widening in an almost predatory way. "You can't. You belong here, Thomas. Like all of us, you're a part of this place now." "No," Thomas said, his voice stronger this time. "I'm not part of this nightmare. I'm not like you. I can wake up." The thing's grin faltered for a moment, and then it lunged, faster than anything Thomas could have anticipated. It reached out, its long, clawed fingers snapping toward him with terrifying speed. But Thomas didn't move. Instead, he focused, forcing every ounce of will into his mind. The creature's hand came inches from his face, but he did nothing. He didn't flinch. He didn't back away. He let the creature get close. He let the darkness close in, because he had nothing to fear anymore. And then, as if something snapped inside him, he screamed. A primal sound, filled with the rage of every fear he had ever suppressed. The creature froze mid-motion, its form beginning to warp, distort, as though Thomas's defiance was too much for it to handle. Its black eyes flickered and cracked, like glass shattering. The smile vanished. The cold, oppressive atmosphere began to crack around him. The train screeched, the wheels grinding to a halt, and for the first time since he boarded, the world stopped moving. And then in the distance, faint and distant, he heard a door open. The sound was soft, but it was there real. "Thomas," the voice whispered again, softer this time. "You can leave now." Thomas's heart stopped. The terror, the suffocating grip on his mind, all of it lifted in an instant. His body shook, but he didn't care. He knew now. He had won. With one final, defiant breath, he turned toward the open door, stepping into the light, leaving the endless train behind. Name of the next story: The Cold Spot. The apartment had been a dream come true for Lisa and Mark. After months of searching, they had finally found a place that was spacious, affordable, and nestled in a quiet neighborhood just far enough from the city to feel like a sanctuary. The building was old, with high ceilings, ornate moldings, and hardwood floors that creaked underfoot. It had character, the kind of charm that made them feel like they were stepping into a little piece of history. But there was something else, too, something they didn't notice at first. The first night in the apartment was uneventful. They unpacked boxes until their backs ached and ordered takeout that they ate sitting on the floor, surrounded by piles of books, dishes, and clothes. The living room became their makeshift haven, its large bay windows letting in soft light from a street lamp outside. As they lay on a mattress pushed against the wall, listening to the faint hum of the city in the distance, Lisa felt a deep sense of peace. "This place is perfect," she whispered, resting her head on Mark's shoulder. "It really is," he replied, kissing her forehead. "I think we're going to be happy here." The first time they noticed the cold spot, it was subtle, barely a flicker of awareness. Lisa was unpacking a box of dishes in the kitchen when she felt it. A faint chill that seemed to drift in from nowhere, brushing against the back of her neck. She paused, frowning, and glanced toward the living room. Mark was on the couch, scrolling through his phone. "Did you leave a window open?" she called out. Mark looked up, confused. "No, why?" "It's freezing in here," she said, rubbing her arms. Mark shrugged. "Old building, I guess. Drafty windows." Lisa nodded, dismissing the thought. But as the days passed, the chill became harder to ignore. It wasn't just a draft, and it wasn't confined to the kitchen. It lingered in the corner of the living room, a small patch of space that seemed immune to the warmth of the radiator or the sunlight streaming through the windows. Lisa joked about it at first, calling it their ghostly AC. Mark laughed, but even he admitted it was strange. One evening, as they were watching TV, Lisa glanced toward the corner where the cold spot seemed to emanate. She shivered involuntarily. "I swear it's getting worse," she said, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Mark reached out to touch her hand, his fingers warm against her icy skin. "You're overthinking it," he said. "It's just an old apartment. Maybe there's something wrong with the insulation." Lisa nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. The cold wasn't just physical. It felt heavy, oppressive, like a presence that pressed against her chest and made it harder to breathe. At night, when the lights were off and the apartment was silent, she could feel it watching her. One night, she woke up shivering. The room was pitch black, and the air felt colder than ever. She reached out for Mark, but his side of the bed was empty. Panic flared in her chest as she sat up, straining to hear any sound. A faint creak came from the living room. "Mark," she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response. She slid out of bed, her feet touching the freezing floor, and crept toward the door. The hallway stretched before her, bathed in shadow. The living room was just ahead, but the cold seemed to radiate from it like a pulse. She hesitated at the threshold, her breath visible in the icy air. "Mark," she called again, louder this time. A figure emerged from the corner, the shadowy outline of her husband. He was standing still, his back to her, facing the wall. "Mark, what are you doing?" Lisa asked, her voice rising in alarm. He didn't move. The cold seemed to intensify, seeping into her skin and making her teeth chatter. She stepped closer, reaching out to touch his shoulder. "Mark?" He turned suddenly, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide and glassy. "I can hear it," he whispered. Lisa froze. "Hear what?" "It's in the walls," he said, his voice barely audible. "It's always been here." Lisa grabbed his arm, pulling him toward her. "You're scaring me. Come back to bed." Mark blinked, as if waking from a trance, and allowed her to lead him back to the bedroom. He didn't say another word, but Lisa could feel the tension in his body, the way his hands trembled as they pulled the blanket over themselves. She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint creaks and whispers that seemed to come from the living room. Over the next few days, Mark became increasingly withdrawn. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and spent most of his time sitting in the living room, staring at the cold corner. Lisa tried to talk to him, to snap him out of whatever spell had taken hold, but he barely responded. His skin grew paler, his eyes more sunken, and he spoke in fragmented sentences that made no sense. "It wants something," he said one afternoon, his voice monotone. "It's hungry." Lisa felt a surge of frustration and fear. "What are you talking about, Mark? You're scaring me. This isn't like you." Mark turned to her, his expression blank. "You'll see." That night, Lisa decided to sleep in the guest room. She couldn't bear the tension in the air, the way the cold seemed to cling to her skin. She curled up under the blankets, her heart pounding, and tried to block out the sound of Mark's muttering in the other room. But sleep didn't come. Around midnight, she heard a sound, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was faint, like the wind passing through a crack, but it carried words she couldn't quite make out. She sat up, her pulse racing, and strained to listen. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the room. Lisa clapped her hands over her ears, but it didn't help. The words were inside her head, cold and sharp, slicing through her thoughts. She stumbled out of bed, disoriented, and made her way to the living room. Mark was sitting in the corner, his back to her, rocking slightly. The cold was unbearable now, a frigid wall of air that made her feel like she was suffocating. "Mark," she said, her voice cracking, "please come back to bed." He didn't respond. She stepped closer, her feet numb against the frozen floor, and reached out to touch his shoulder. As soon as her fingers made contact, he turned to her, his face twisted into a mask of anguish. "It's too late," he whispered. "It's here." The whispering grew louder, a deafening roar that seemed to vibrate through the walls. The room went dark, the air thick and heavy, and Lisa felt herself being pulled toward the corner. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. Lisa clawed at the floor, trying to anchor herself, but the pull was relentless. It was as though an unseen force was dragging her into the cold, dark corner. The icy air tore at her skin, and her breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale visible in the freezing atmosphere. Her vision blurred, but she could still see Mark, sitting motionless, his eyes locked on the wall as if he were hypnotized. "Mark, help me!" she screamed, her voice cracking. Mark didn't move. His lips quivered as if he wanted to speak but couldn't form the words. Instead, his gaze shifted to her, and she saw tears streaming down his hollow cheeks. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It won't let me." The pull grew stronger, and Lisa felt her body sliding across the floor. Her fingers scraped against the hardwood, splinters digging into her skin as she fought to hold on. The whispering was deafening now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from the walls, the floor, and the very air around her. The words were incomprehensible, but they carried a weight that pressed down on her chest, making it impossible to breathe. Just as she thought she would be swallowed by the void, the pull suddenly ceased. The air grew still, and the whispering stopped. Lisa collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. Her limbs were numb, and her body ached from the strain. She looked up, expecting to see the cold corner looming over her, but it was gone. The living room was quiet, bathed in the faint glow of the street lamp outside. "Mark," she called out weakly. He was still sitting in the corner, his head bowed and his hands resting limply on his knees. She crawled toward him, her movements slow and deliberate, and placed a hand on his shoulder. His skin was ice cold. "Mark, it's over," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever that was, it's gone." Mark lifted his head, and Lisa recoiled in horror. His eyes were completely black, the irises and whites swallowed by an inky void. His face was gaunt, his cheeks hollow, and his skin stretched tightly over his bones. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out, only a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down Lisa's spine. "Mark, no," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "What happened to you?" He reached out and grabbed her wrist, his grip impossibly strong. His fingers were like icicles, biting into her skin and sending a shock of pain through her arm. She tried to pull away, but he held her firmly, his black eyes staring into hers. "It's not me," he said, his voice distorted and unnatural. "It's inside." Lisa screamed and wrenched herself free, stumbling backward and falling onto the floor. Mark rose slowly, his movements jerky and unnatural, as if he were a puppet on invisible strings. The cold radiated from him now, filling the room and making the air feel thick and heavy. "Leave me alone," Lisa cried, crawling backward until her back hit the wall. Mark tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "You can't escape it," he said. "It's part of you now." Lisa shook her head, her heart pounding in her chest. "No, you're lying. This isn't real." Mark took a step toward her, his body moving with an unsettling stiffness. "You felt it the moment we moved in. It's always been here waiting. And now it's found you." She scrambled to her feet and bolted for the door, her mind racing. She didn't know where she was going or what she would do, but she had to get out. The cold seemed to follow her, wrapping around her like a suffocating shroud. She reached the front door and yanked it open, only to be met with an impenetrable darkness. The hallway was gone, replaced by a void that stretched endlessly in every direction. "No, no, no," she muttered, backing away from the door. "This isn't happening." The door slammed shut behind her, and she spun around to see Mark standing in the center of the living room. The cold radiated from him in waves, and the shadows in the room seemed to shift and writhe like living things. "You can't leave," he said. "They won't let you." Lisa's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. She thought about the cold spot, the whispers, the way Mark had changed. It all felt like a nightmare, but the pain in her body and the fear in her heart were all too real. "What does it want?" she demanded, her voice shaking. Mark's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It wants everything. Your warmth, your memories, your soul. It feeds on despair." Lisa felt a surge of anger rise within her, cutting through her fear. "I won't let it take me," she said. "I won't give in." Mark laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that made her skin crawl. "You don't have a choice. It's already begun." The shadows in the room grew darker, creeping along the walls and floor like tendrils. The cold intensified, and Lisa felt her strength draining away. She stumbled backward, her vision blurring as the air grew heavier and heavier. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, drowning out her thoughts. Just as she felt herself slipping into unconsciousness, a sudden warmth enveloped her. It was faint, like the glow of a dying ember, but it was enough to push back the cold. She looked down and saw that she was holding something in her hand, a small, silver pendant that she had unpacked earlier that day. It had belonged to her grandmother, a gift she had always cherished. The warmth grew stronger, spreading through her body and driving away the cold. The whispers faded, and the shadows recoiled as if burned by an unseen force. Mark let out a guttural scream and fell to the floor, his body convulsing. Lisa clutched the pendant tightly, tears streaming down her face. "You're not taking us," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. The shadows seemed to hesitate, wavering in the air like smoke. The cold receded further, and the room grew brighter as the street lamp's light pierced the darkness. Mark stopped convulsing and lay still, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Lisa approached him cautiously, the pendant still clutched in her hand. "Mark," she whispered. His eyes fluttered open, and she let out a sob of relief when she saw that they were no longer black. He looked up at her, confusion and fear etched on his face. "Lisa? What happened?" She knelt beside him, pulling him into her arms. "It's over," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know how, but it's over." Mark clung to her, his body trembling. The cold spot in the corner was gone, and the apartment felt warm for the first time since they had moved in. But as they sat there, holding each other, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, something that wasn't entirely gone. Name of the next story, The Blood Moon Pact. The friends gathered in the small, dimly lit tavern at the edge of the village, their laughter cutting through the quiet hum of whispered conversations. It had been years since they had all been together. Life had pulled them in different directions, jobs, families, and distance. But now they were here reunited in the remote village of Red Hollow, where Liam had invited them to stay for a weekend retreat. Liam had always been the planner, the one who held them together. He'd found this village while researching rural getaways and discovered that their visit coincided with the rare occurrence of a blood moon. "It'll be unforgettable," he had said in the group chat, attaching photos of a rustic old house he'd rented for them to stay in. The house, he claimed, had character, but as the group stepped inside, it seemed more like it had secrets. The floorboards creaked under their weight, and the smell of damp wood and mildew clung to the air. The living room was dominated by a large stone fireplace, its mantel adorned with peculiar carvings that none of them recognized. Tall, thin windows let in the faint glow of the setting sun, and the shadows seemed to stretch and shift unnaturally as the light dimmed. "This place is, atmospheric," Natalie said, her voice trailing off as her eyes scanned the room. "You mean creepy," Danny added, tossing his backpack onto a worn armchair. "Why does every horror movie start like this?" "Relax," Liam replied, rolling his eyes. "It's old, sure, but it's cozy. Plus, I read that the locals here have all these cool traditions tied to the blood moon. It's part of their folklore." "Folklore?" Sarah asked, raising an eyebrow as she helped herself to a bottle of wine they'd brought along. "Yeah, like old superstitions. Something about the moon being a time when the veil between worlds is thinner." "I don't know. I thought it'd add to the vibe," Liam said with a grin. Natalie shivered, pulling her sweater tighter around her. "I don't know if I want to be anywhere near thin veils." The group laughed, but the unease in her voice lingered. Outside, the sky deepened into a dark crimson hue as the blood moon began its slow ascent. After dinner, they decided to explore the village. Red Hollow was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The cobblestone streets were empty, and the windows of the small houses lining the road were dark. Only the faint flicker of candlelight from the tavern hinted at any life. As they walked, they noticed strange symbols carved into the doorframes of every home. Circles with jagged edges, crescent shapes, and lines that intersected in ways that made their eyes hurt if they stared too long. "Looks like the locals take their folklore pretty seriously," Danny said, his voice low. "Maybe it's just decoration," Sarah suggested, though her tone lacked conviction. "Or maybe they're trying to keep something out," Natalie whispered, her words hanging in the cold air like a warning. They stopped at the edge of the village square, where an ancient stone well stood at its center. A plaque at the base of the well caught their attention, its inscription worn, but still legible under the light of Liam's phone. "The pact," Liam read aloud. "On the night of the crimson moon, a promise is kept, and a price is paid." "That's ominous." Before anyone could respond, an old man emerged from the shadows of a nearby alley. His face was gaunt, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His eyes, dark and unblinking, seemed to pierce through them. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his voice rasping like dry leaves. We're just visiting," Liam said, trying to sound casual. The man shook his head. "Leave. Before it's too late." "Too late for what?" Natalie asked, her voice trembling. "The moon is hungry," he said, his gaze fixed on the sky. "And it always gets what it's owed." The group exchanged uneasy glances, but before they could ask any more questions, the man turned and disappeared into the darkness. "Okay, that was creepy," Sarah said, her voice breaking the silence. "Probably just some local trying to mess with the tourists," Liam said, though his attempt to sound confident fell flat. They returned to the house, but the strange encounter lingered in their minds. As the hours passed, the atmosphere inside grew heavier, and an unnatural chill seeped into the air. Natalie was the first to notice it. Is anyone else freezing? She asked, rubbing her arms. It's like the temperature dropped 20 degrees. Danny checked the thermostat. It says it's 70 in here, but it doesn't feel like it. The chill seemed to center around the fireplace. The carvings on the mantel, which had seemed merely odd before, now appeared sinister in the flickering light of the fire. One by one, they began to notice things out of place, shadows that didn't align with their source, whispers that faded the moment they tried to listen, and a faint hum that seemed to emanate from the stone walls. "I don't like this," Sarah said, clutching her wine glass. "Something about this place feels wrong. Let's just go to bed," Liam suggested. "We'll feel better in the morning." But morning didn't bring relief. Instead, they woke to find strange symbols etched into the windows, the same ones they'd seen on the houses in the village. The cold had worsened, and the fire refused to stay lit no matter how much wood they added. The blood moon still hung in the sky, though it was faint in the daylight, casting an eerie red glow over everything. "This doesn't make any sense," Liam said, pacing the room. "It's like the village is trapped in some kind of time loop." "I told you," Natalie said, her voice tight with fear. "Something is wrong here. We need to leave." They packed their bags and headed for the car, but the roads leading out of the village were blocked by thick fog that seemed almost alive. Every turn brought them back to the same place, the stone well in the village square. "It's like we're being herded," Danny said, his voice barely above a whisper. That night, as the blood moon reached its peak, the whispers grew louder, forming words they couldn't understand but instinctively feared. The chill became unbearable, and the symbols on the windows began to glow faintly. Then came the knocking, a slow, deliberate sound that echoed through the house. "No one opened that door," Natalie said, her voice shaking. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. Liam, unable to resist, approached the door. As he reached for the handle, the old man from the village appeared behind him, as if out of thin air. "You've made a mistake," the man said, "but there's still a chance to set it right." "What do you mean?" Liam asked, his hand trembling on the door. "The pact," the man said. "The village's promise to the moon. Every 100 years, it demands a soul, or more. If you're here, it means the moon has chosen you." "That's insane," Sarah said. "We didn't agree to anything." "It doesn't matter," the man replied. "The moon cares only for the pact, not who fulfills it." The whispers grew deafening, and the door began to splinter as if something was clawing at it from the other side. "What do we do?" Natalie screamed. The old man handed Liam a dagger, its blade etched with the same symbols that adorned the houses and windows. "You have to offer a sacrifice. Only blood can satisfy the moon." Liam stared at the dagger in his hand, the flickering firelight dancing along its strange symbols. His heart pounded as he turned to the old man, his voice cracking. "You're saying I have to kill someone? That's the only way to stop this." The old man's face was unyielding, his eyes hollow and unfeeling. "Not just someone," he rasped. "The moon's hunger is specific. It craves the blood of those it's bound to, those who are here under its gaze tonight." Natalie stepped back, her eyes wide with panic. "You're insane. There's no way we're doing this." Her voice shook as she pointed toward the door. "This is all some sick game." The old man didn't flinch. "You've already been chosen. If you don't act, the moon will take all of you. It does not bargain. It does not wait." The house groaned, the walls vibrating as the knocking turned into pounding. The air grew colder still, and their breath came out in visible puffs. Shadows darted across the walls, moving in unnatural ways, their shapes warping and twisting. "Liam, put that thing down," Danny said, his voice firm but his hands trembling. "We can figure this out. There has to be another way." "There isn't," the old man interrupted sharply. "You're all fools if you think you can outlast it. The moon always gets what it's owed." "Stop it!" Sarah screamed, clutching her head. "Just stop." The pounding on the door grew more violent, and the whispers swelled, no longer distant but close, as if someone, or something, was speaking directly into their ears. Words they couldn't understand filled their minds, and with each syllable, a deep dread settled in their chests. "Liam," Natalie whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Don't listen to him. Please. There's got to be another way." But Liam's hand tightened around the hilt of the dagger, his knuckles white. He looked at each of them in turn, Danny, Sarah, Natalie, the people he had called his closest friends, the people he had brought here. "This is my fault," he said, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of whispers and pounding. "I brought us here. I didn't know, but I still brought us here." "No!" Natalie shouted, stepping forward. "Liam, don't do this. You're not a murderer." Liam shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "I'm trying to save you." Before anyone could stop him, he raised the dagger and plunged it into his own chest. The room seemed to freeze. The whispers stopped. The pounding ceased. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of Liam's ragged breathing as he collapsed to his knees, blood pooling beneath him. "Liam!" Sarah screamed, rushing to his side. She tried to press her hands against the wound, but the blood wouldn't stop. The old man watched, unblinking. "That won't be enough," he said coldly. Danny spun on him, fury in his eyes. "You said a sacrifice would end this." "I said the moon demands blood," the old man replied. "But one life won't quench its thirst when so many are offered." The realization hit them all at once. The pact wasn't for a single soul. It was for as many as the moon could claim. The room began to shake violently, and the shadows on the walls grew, stretching into grotesque, monstrous forms. The blood moon's light poured through the windows, bathing the room in a crimson glow. The symbols on the walls and windows burned brighter, their light almost blinding. Natalie backed into a corner, her hands over her ears as the whispers returned, louder than ever. They spoke her name now, over and over like a chant. "No," she whimpered. "No, no, no." Danny grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the door. "We have to get out of here. Now." But when he reached for the door handle, it burned his hand. He yelped, stumbling back. The door was glowing red-hot, as if the moon itself was holding it shut. Liam's body lay motionless on the floor, his blood seeping into the cracks of the wooden boards. The old man knelt beside him, his hands hovering over the dagger. He murmured something under his breath, a string of words that sounded ancient and otherworldly. "What are you doing?" Sarah demanded, her voice shaking. "Trying to appease it," the old man said, though his tone held little hope. "But it may already be too late." The shadows began to coalesce, pulling away from the walls and taking shape in the center of the room. They formed a figure, tall and inhuman, its face obscured by swirling darkness. Two glowing red eyes emerged from the void, locking onto the group. Danny stepped in front of Natalie and Sarah, his fists clenched though he was trembling. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice cracked with fear. The figure didn't move, but its presence pressed down on them like a physical weight. The air felt thick, suffocating. It raised a hand, or something resembling a hand, and pointed toward them. The whispers stopped, replaced by a single, guttural word, "Choose." "No!" Natalie screamed, shaking her head violently. "We're not playing your game." The figure didn't react. It simply pointed again, the weight of its gaze making it impossible to look away. Sarah sobbed, clutching Natalie's arm. "What do we do? What do we do?" Danny's jaw tightened. He looked at the old man. "Is there any way out of this?" The old man didn't answer. He simply lowered his head, his silence speaking volumes. The shadows began to close in, the cold so intense now that frost formed on the walls and floor. The figure loomed closer, its presence overwhelming, its glowing eyes unblinking. Danny turned to the group, his face pale. "We have to do something," he said, his voice cracking. "If we don't, it's going to take all of us." Natalie shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Danny shouted, his voice filled with desperation. "This thing, it's not going to stop." The figure's hand stretched toward them, the air around it crackling with unnatural energy. The whispers began again, louder and more insistent, their words burrowing into their minds like claws. Danny took a step forward, his fists clenched. "Take me," he said, his voice trembling but steady. "Leave them alone." The figure paused, its head tilting slightly as if considering his offer. Then slowly it lowered its hand. For a moment, the room was silent. Then the shadows surged forward, enveloping Danny. His screams filled the room, echoing off the walls as the darkness consumed him. When the shadows receded, he was gone. Natalie and Sarah clung to each other, their sobs the only sound in the room. The old man stood, his face grim. "The pact is fulfilled," he said quietly. The blood moon's light began to fade, and the house grew still. But the weight of what had happened lingered, pressing down on them like a heavy shroud. The silence that followed Danny's disappearance was deafening. Natalie and Sarah were frozen in place, their bodies trembling as the red glow of the blood moon dimmed further. The oppressive chill seemed to lift ever so slightly, but the air remained heavy with dread. Natalie's voice finally broke the quiet, trembling and soft. "He's gone," she whispered, staring at the spot where Danny had been. "He's gone." Sarah clutched her friend tighter, her nails digging into Natalie's arm. "This can't be real." "It's not real," she murmured, rocking slightly. "It's a nightmare. We'll wake up." The old man's voice cut through the moment, cold and matter-of-fact. "The pact is never a dream. It's as old as the moon itself. And now it is over." Natalie's head snapped up, fury replacing her terror. "Over? You call this over? We've lost Liam, Danny. What kind of monster are you?" Her voice cracked, tears streaming down her face. The old man didn't flinch. "It is the cost of meddling with forces you don't understand. You shouldn't have come here. The moon only takes those who wander into its shadow willingly." Sarah's sobs grew louder, and she buried her face in her hands. "Why didn't you warn us? You knew this would happen." "I tried," the old man replied, his tone laced with weariness. "But once the blood moon rises, the choice is no longer yours. You stepped into its light, and it claimed you. The village is cursed. It always has been." Natalie stood abruptly, her knees shaking as she pointed a trembling finger at the old man. "You're lying. You could have done something. You wanted this to happen. You're part of this." The old man's expression hardened, but before he could reply, the house groaned violently. The shadows on the walls shivered, and a low rumble filled the air. The blood moon's light, faint as it had become, flared brighter for a brief moment before receding again, as though taunting them. "No," the old man muttered, his voice unusually sharp. His eyes darted to the window. "This isn't right." Natalie and Sarah exchanged a terrified glance. "What do you mean, this isn't right?" Natalie demanded, panic rising in her voice. "You said it was over." The old man stepped toward the window, his gnarled hands trembling as he pulled back the curtain. Outside, the moon loomed larger than ever, its crimson hue pulsating like a beating heart. The village square below was bathed in its unholy light, and the distant shapes of the houses looked warped, their edges twisting unnaturally. "It's still hungry," he said, his voice barely audible. "The blood moon, it hasn't been satisfied." Natalie's breath hitched. "What does that mean?" "We gave it what it wanted. Danny, Liam." The old man turned to them, his face pale and grave. "Something has changed. It's as if the moon's appetite has grown. It doesn't just want blood anymore. It wants everything." The house shook again, harder this time, and the walls seemed to ripple as though they were made of liquid. The cold returned, sharper and more biting than before, and the whispers resumed, louder and more chaotic, filling the room with a cacophony of unintelligible voices. Sarah screamed, falling to the floor and covering her ears. "Make it stop! Make it stop!" Natalie knelt beside her, shaking her head desperately. "I don't know what to do. I don't know." The old man staggered back, clutching his chest as though the very air had turned poisonous. The pact is unraveling, he choked out. This is no longer about the village. The moon, it's reaching for the world beyond. The shadows began to pool in the center of the room again, darker and more oppressive than before. This time, the figure that emerged was no longer vaguely humanoid. It was a writhing mass of darkness, its form constantly shifting and changing, its glowing red eyes multiplying until there were dozens, all fixated on the three of them. Natalie felt her mind teetering on the edge of collapse. The thing in front of her wasn't just a shadow or a monster. It was a force, ancient and incomprehensible. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her body refused to move. The creature didn't speak this time. Instead, the whispers coalesced into a single, resonant voice that echoed inside their heads. More. Natalie clutched her head, the word reverberating through her skull like a hammer. I don't understand, she screamed. What do you want from us? The voice came again, deeper and more insistent. Everything. The room began to dissolve around them, the walls melting away into darkness. The floor beneath their feet crumbled, and they found themselves suspended in an endless void, the blood moon hanging above them like a malevolent god. Sarah's screams turned into incoherent sobs as she clung to Natalie. We're going to die, she whimpered. It's going to take us. The old man stood motionless, his face a mask of resignation. There's no escaping it now, he said quietly. This is the end. But Natalie wasn't ready to give up. She turned to the old man, her eyes blazing with desperation. There has to be a way to stop this. You know something, tell me. The old man hesitated, his gaze fixed on the dagger still clutched in Liam's lifeless hand. The pact can only be undone by the one who first broke it, he said slowly. The one who brought you here. Natalie froze, her mind racing. You mean me? She asked, her voice trembling. The old man nodded. The moon marks the instigator. It sees you as the one responsible. If you give yourself willingly, it may spare the others. No, Sarah cried, grabbing Natalie's arm. You can't do that. There has to be another way. Natalie looked at her friend, tears streaming down her face. If I don't, it's going to take everyone. Not just us, everyone. Sarah shook her head violently, her grip tightening. I won't let you. You're my best friend. I can't lose you too. The figure loomed closer, its countless eyes burning brighter. The whispers grew deafening, pressing down on them like a physical force. Natalie felt her knees buckle under the weight of it, but she forced herself to stand. She met Sarah's tear-filled gaze and gave her a weak, trembling smile. You've always been stronger than me, she said softly. You'll make it through this. Promise me you will. Natalie, no! Sarah screamed, but Natalie had already stepped forward, clutching the dagger tightly in her hand. The blood moon's light seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat as she raised the blade. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. For everything. And with that, she plunged the dagger into her own chest. The void exploded with light, the whispers turning into an agonized roar. The shadows writhed and twisted, the figure dissolving into nothingness as the blood moon's glow dimmed and dimmed until it was gone. The void was silent. For a long moment, everything stood still. No sound, no movement. Just a dark, empty expanse stretching infinitely in all directions. Natalie's body, bloodied from the dagger, lay motionless in the center of it all. Then, a faint pulse of light flickered from the distance. It wasn't the blood moon this time. It was something else, something faint, like the dying flicker of a candle. Sarah's breaths came in shallow, frantic gasps. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear the blurriness from her eyes, the world around her still nothing but shadow and the faint, distant glow. Her hands were trembling, but she reached out to touch the ground beneath her, the sensation of solidity returning. The cold still hung thick in the air, but there was something else now, something softer. Is it over? Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse, cracking. Her heart was still racing in her chest, her mind reeling from what had just transpired. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on her. Natalie's sacrifice, the monstrous force that had consumed their friends. Was it truly over? Slowly, the edges of the world around her began to form again, like the peeling away of a veil. The shadows dissipated, the oppressive, overwhelming darkness lifting. She saw the old man standing near Natalie's body, his eyes closed, his expression unreadable. His gnarled hands were clasped in front of him, as though in mourning. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she stumbled to her feet. She tried to speak, but found her voice lost. She tried again, her throat dry, cracking under the weight of the horror she'd just witnessed. "Is she?" Sarah whispered, staring at her best friend's lifeless form. The old man turned to Sarah, his face etched with sorrow. "She did what was necessary," he said softly, his voice carrying an air of finality. "The pact is broken, but at a great cost." Sarah felt a sudden wave of nausea wash over her, her legs growing weak beneath her. She staggered back, her heart pounding in her chest. The blood moon was gone, but the feeling of dread still lingered. Her eyes darted around, but the village, the cursed place that had held them captive, was now shrouded in a strange stillness. It was over, but at what price? "Why?" Sarah asked, her voice cracking. "Why didn't you tell us the truth? Why didn't you warn us?" The old man's gaze softened. "The truth was always there. But the moon, it has a way of clouding judgment, of twisting the path of those who dare seek it. None of you were meant to be here. None of you were meant to witness this. Then why bring us here at all?" Sarah demanded, her anger rising despite the overwhelming grief. "Why play us like pawns in your sick game?" The old man sighed deeply, as if weighed down by centuries of regret. "You were not meant to be pawns. You were meant to fulfill the final part of the pact. Only the blood of the willing could break the curse that has held this village for so long." Sarah felt a pit open in her stomach. "The willing," she whispered, realizing the dark truth behind his words. "The moon demanded your souls," the old man continued. "It seeks a price for the power it bestows." Natalie knew that. She understood that if you all were to survive, someone had to pay the price, and it could not be the others. Sarah's head spun. Her heartache intensified. She wanted to scream, to rage, to tear into this man who had lured them all here, into this nightmare. But instead she stood frozen, her eyes locked on Natalie's body, her best friend's face now pale and still, a victim of forces too dark to comprehend. "She saved us," Sarah whispered through her tears, falling to her knees beside Natalie. "She saved all of us." The old man nodded. "And in doing so, she freed you. The pact is undone. The village is free." Sarah looked up at him, confusion and sorrow swirling within her. "What happens now? What about the others?" The old man turned his gaze to the horizon, his expression distant. "The moon will not return for another century, but the shadows of this night will haunt you forever. You will remember, and you will carry the weight of what you've seen. But you will also live. The rest," he trailed off, his voice becoming a low murmur, "the rest is not for me to say." Sarah's tears flowed freely as she held Natalie's body close, unable to shake the images of what had occurred. The unnatural horror of the night, the blood moon, the ancient pact, the terror and loss, felt too heavy to carry alone. And yet, she would have to. She would have to leave this place behind and walk back into the world, scarred by what she'd witnessed, scarred by what Natalie had done. The old man, still standing there, gave Sarah one last look, a quiet acknowledgement of the suffering that had unfolded. He then turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the distance. The strange, suffocating atmosphere that had filled the village lifted as he left, and with it, the eerie quiet. Sarah remained by Natalie's side, her friend's cold body in her arms. She could hear the faint hum of the wind, the rustling of leaves, the soft sounds of the world outside beginning to return. It was almost as though the nightmare hadn't truly happened. Yet, the weight of everything that had transpired was etched deeply into Sarah's soul. She stayed there for what felt like hours, the silence of the now peaceful village surrounding her, Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she stood and carefully laid Natalie's body to rest beneath the old oak tree, the only place that had felt safe during their brief stay in the village. With shaking hands, Sarah began the long walk back toward the village square, her heart heavy, her mind reeling. The sun was beginning to rise, casting soft, golden light on the landscape. It was a new day, but Sarah knew that the horrors of the night would follow her. The blood moon might be gone, but its curse had not been erased. As she walked, she whispered one last goodbye to Natalie, her voice trembling in the still air. "You saved us. You'll never be forgotten." The wind picked up again, rustling through the trees and carrying her words into the distance. And so, as Sarah left the village behind, the blood moon faded from the sky, but its shadows lingered long after the dawn. Name of the next story: The Faceless Stranger. The night was unnaturally still, as if the world had paused just long enough to hold its breath. Allison tightened her coat around her as she stepped out of the brightly lit coffee shop. The last bus had already left, and the only thing waiting for her was a long, lonely walk home. She hated these late shifts, but tonight felt different. The air carried a chill that seemed to seep beneath her skin, and the streets were quieter than usual, too quiet. Her boots echoed against the pavement, each step magnified in the silence. The rows of streetlights cast long, distorted shadows on the cracked sidewalks. She glanced at her phone. 10:47 p.m. Her apartment was only 20 minutes away, but every second felt like an eternity. As she passed the intersection near the old church, she saw him for the first time. A man stood on the opposite side of the road, partially obscured by the shadows of a flickering streetlight. He was tall, with a dark coat and a hat that cast a deep shadow over his face, or where his face should have been. Allison slowed her steps, her heart skipping. "Keep walking," she muttered to herself, trying to sound braver than she felt. She forced her gaze ahead and quickened her pace. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her. She froze for a split second, but the footsteps stopped too. Turning slightly, she glanced over her shoulder. The man was now closer, standing under the next streetlight. The flickering bulb above him illuminated his silhouette, but his face, or lack of one, remained in shadow. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. No response. Allison turned back and walked faster, her pulse pounding in her ears. The sound of footsteps resumed behind her, this time louder, heavier, as though he was closing the distance with deliberate intent. She risked another glance. He was closer now, no more than 20 feet away. Her breath hitched. His face, or where his face should have been, was a smooth, featureless void like blank, pale clay. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just emptiness. "Stop following me," she shouted, her voice cracking. The man tilted his head slightly, as if curious, but said nothing. Allison's grip tightened on her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed 911. The line rang once, twice, and then static. A low, hissing sound filled her ears, and the call cut off. "No, no, no," she whispered, frantically redialing, but the screen flashed no service. She broke into a sprint. Her apartment wasn't far now, just a few more blocks. The footsteps behind her quickened, heavy and relentless, matching her panicked pace. "Help! Somebody please!" she screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the suffocating quiet of the night. Windows were dark, shops were closed, and the streets were empty. She risked another glance over her shoulder. He was closer now, close enough that she could make out the details of his dark coat and the unsettling smoothness of his featureless face. He didn't run. He simply walked, each step deliberate and unhurried, yet he was gaining on her. Allison's legs burned as she turned the corner onto her street. Her apartment building loomed ahead, a beacon of safety, or so she hoped. She fumbled for her keys as she reached the front door, her hands shaking so badly she dropped them. Come on," she muttered, crouching to scoop them up. Her vision blurred with tears as she shoved the key into the lock and twisted. The door clicked open, and she slammed it shut behind her, bolting it tight. She pressed her back against the door, panting, her heart racing. For a moment, there was silence. Maybe she had lost him. Maybe he hadn't followed her inside. A faint tapping sound echoed from the other side of the door. Tap, tap, tap. Allison, a voice whispered. It was low, distorted, like a radio signal warped by interference. Her blood turned to ice. He hadn't spoken before. How did he know her name? "Who are you?" she screamed, pressing her hands against her ears. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it became a deafening pounding. The door shook on its hinges, and the lights in the hallway flickered. "Allison," the voice repeated, closer now, as if it was inside her head. "Let me in." She bolted up the stairs to her apartment, slamming the door shut behind her and locking it. Her breaths came in short, shallow gasps as she backed into the living room. The pounding continued, now at her apartment door. She grabbed the nearest thing she could use as a weapon, a heavy metal lamp, and held it tightly. "I'll call the police," she shouted, knowing it was useless. Her phone still showed no service. The pounding stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It pressed down on her, suffocating and absolute. Then she heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, coming from behind her. "Allison." Her heart plummeted as she turned slowly. The man was standing in her living room, impossibly tall and out of place, his faceless head tilted in that same unnerving way. She screamed, swinging the lamp with all her strength, but it passed through him as if he weren't there. He didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, his blank face staring, or not staring at her. "Allison," he whispered again, his voice resonating in her mind like an echo in an empty room. "What do you want from me?" she cried, collapsing to her knees. He took a step closer. The air around her grew heavy, and the walls of her apartment seemed to bend and warp, the edges of her reality blurring. "You," he said, the word sending a wave of cold dread through her. Allison's world felt as though it was crumbling around her. The walls of her apartment, once familiar and comforting, seemed to stretch and shift unnaturally, as if the room itself were alive and breathing. She pressed her palms against the floor, trying to ground herself, but even that felt wrong. The hardwood beneath her fingertips was cold, almost wet, like the floor of a damp cave. The faceless man took another step closer, his presence unbearable. He loomed over her now, his blank face inches from hers. She wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but her body refused to obey. It was as if his proximity drained her of all strength, leaving her frozen and powerless. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What do you want?" The air seemed to vibrate around him, the faintest hint of a low hum filling the room. Then he spoke, his voice layered and distorted, as though it came from several people speaking in unison. "To make you mine," he said. "To make you nothing." The word sent a wave of nausea through her, and she clutched her stomach, feeling as though something inside her was being pulled apart. She forced her gaze upward, her tears blurring his featureless face into a pale smear. "Why me? What did I do?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached out a long, pale hand. His fingers, unnaturally elongated and jointless, hovered just above her face. She tried to recoil, but her body remained frozen. The moment his hand made contact with her skin, a searing cold spread through her, like ice shattering inside her veins. Images flashed through her mind, memories of her childhood, her first day of school, her mother's laugh, her college graduation. They played out in vivid detail, only to dissolve into darkness, each one vanishing as quickly as it came. She could feel him pulling them from her, erasing her, one moment at a time. "No!" she screamed, summoning all her strength to push him away. Her hands passed through him as if he were made of smoke, but the contact broke whatever spell had held her still. She scrambled backward, her head spinning. The memories he'd taken felt like gaping holes in her mind, void she couldn't fill. The man tilted his head again, almost as if amused, and stepped toward her. "You cannot escape," he said, his voice echoing in her head. "You belong to me now." Allison staggered to her feet and bolted for the door. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to get away from him. The apartment hallway stretched impossibly long, the light at the far end flickering erratically. She ran as fast as her legs would carry her, but no matter how far she went, the end of the hallway never came closer. Behind her, she could hear his footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unrelenting. "There is nowhere to run," his voice whispered, though it sounded as if it were coming from inside her head rather than from behind her. She glanced over her shoulder and instantly regretted it. He was closer than he should have been, his smooth, blank face illuminated by the dim, flickering lights. He wasn't running. He didn't need to. He simply walked, and the world seemed to bend to his will, closing the distance between them. "Stop!" she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Please, just leave me alone." "You were never alone," he replied, his voice low and chilling. "I've always been with you." The words sent a shiver down her spine. She didn't understand what he meant, but the way he said it made her feel as though he wasn't lying. She stumbled, her foot catching on the uneven floor, and fell hard onto her hands and knees. Pain shot through her wrists, but she forced herself up, driven by sheer desperation. Ahead of her, the hallway finally came to an end, opening into a staircase that spiraled downward. It didn't make sense. There was no staircase in her apartment building. But logic didn't matter anymore. She took the stairs two at a time, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The air grew colder as she descended, each step echoing endlessly in the dark, narrow stairwell. She could hear him following her, his footsteps steady and deliberate. The further she went, the more the staircase seemed to stretch, the walls pressing closer together until they felt like they were closing in on her. At last, she reached the bottom. She burst through a heavy wooden door into a vast, empty room that looked nothing like anything she had ever seen. The walls were made of rough, black stone, slick with moisture, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth. The only light came from an eerie, pale glow that seemed to emanate from the cracks in the stone floor. Allison turned in a frantic circle, searching for a way out, but there were no doors, no windows, nothing but the oppressive stone walls and the faint glow beneath her feet. Her chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath, her eyes darting around for any sign of an escape. "You cannot hide," his voice said, and this time it came from everywhere at once. The walls seemed to vibrate with the sound, the very air around her resonating with his words. She spun around, and there he was, standing in the center of the room. He hadn't come through the door. He was simply there, as if he had always been. His faceless head tilted slightly as he raised one hand, pointing directly at her. "This is your end," he said. "You will become nothing, just as I am." "No!" Allison screamed, backing away until her back hit the cold stone wall. "You're lying. You're not real." The ground beneath her feet began to shift, the cracks in the stone widening as a pale, sickly light poured through. She could feel it pulling at her, an invisible force that seemed to draw her toward the widening fissures. "I am more real than you," he said, his voice calm and absolute. "You were never meant to exist. But now I will fix that." Allison pressed her back harder against the cold stone wall, her nails scraping against its rough surface as if she could claw her way through it. The force pulling at her from the cracks beneath her feet grew stronger, like invisible hands gripping her ankles and dragging her toward the gaping void. She struggled to hold her ground, but her feet slid inch by inch, the glowing fissures expanding to swallow more of the room. "Please stop," she begged, her voice raw and desperate. "I don't understand. Why are you doing this to me?" The faceless man took a slow step forward, his movements unnervingly graceful, as though he wasn't constrained by the same laws of motion as her. "You were never meant to be," he said, his voice resonating in a way that made the walls tremble. "Your existence is an error. a fracture in the fabric of what is real. And I am here to correct it. No, she whispered, shaking her head violently. You're wrong. I'm real. I have a life. I have memories. Do you? He interrupted, his head tilting slightly to one side. Are they truly yours? Or are they pieces stolen from what should have been? His words struck her like a physical blow, and for a moment she faltered. The memories he had taken from her childhood, her mother's laugh, her life, they felt so vivid, so real. But now, as she clung to the fragments that remained, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered doubts she hadn't considered before. What are you talking about? She stammered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the cracks beneath her feet growing wider, the light brighter. The faceless man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he raised a hand and gestured toward the glowing fissures in the floor. From within them, shapes began to emerge, shadows writhing and twisting, their forms indistinct but undeniably human. They rose like smoke, their outlines flickering as though they were caught between existence and oblivion. Do you see them? He asked, his voice carrying a chilling calm. These are the fragments, the echoes of what was meant to be. You are but a shadow of someone else's life, a hollow reflection that has stolen the place of another. And now, it is time to set things right. The shadows began to move toward her, their shapes shifting and distorting with each step. They didn't walk so much as glide, their movements unnatural and alien. Allison's breath caught in her throat as she pressed herself tighter against the wall, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out every other sound. No, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. This isn't real. This can't be real. The faceless man stepped closer, the edges of his form flickering like a static-filled image on a broken television screen. You can deny it all you want, he said, his tone almost sympathetic, but it will not change the truth. You do not belong here. The shadows were nearly upon her now, their dark forms reaching out with elongated, wispy arms. Allison felt their touch before they made contact, a cold, searing presence that seemed to reach inside her and pull at the very core of her being. She screamed, her voice echoing off the stone walls, but there was no one to hear her. Stop it, she cried, her voice breaking. I don't want this. I didn't ask for any of this. The faceless man paused, tilting his head as though considering her words. For a brief moment, the room seemed to still, the shadows hesitating in their approach. But then he spoke again, his voice softer but no less chilling. None of us ask for what we are, he said, but that does not change what must be. With a flick of his hand, the shadows surged forward, their cold, intangible forms engulfing her. Allison felt a crushing weight as they surrounded her, their presence filling every corner of her mind. Memories, her memories, flashed before her eyes, faster and faster, until they were nothing but a blur of colors and sounds. She could feel them slipping away, pulled from her grasp like sand through her fingers. No, she screamed, thrashing against the overwhelming force. I won't let you take this from me. In a final, desperate act, she reached deep within herself, searching for something, anything, that could fight back against the void threatening to consume her. And then she felt it, a spark, small but burning with fierce intensity. It was the core of her, the part of her that refused to be erased. With a guttural scream, she pushed back against the shadows, her will clashing against the force that sought to unmake her. The fissures in the ground pulsed with blinding light, the room shaking violently as the shadows recoiled. The faceless man took a step back, his form flickering more erratically now, as though he were struggling to maintain his shape. You cannot fight this, he said, his voice carrying a note of urgency. You cannot change what you are. But Allison didn't listen. She focused all her strength on the spark within her, feeding it with every ounce of defiance she had left. The light from the fissures began to dim, the shadows retreating as her presence pushed them back. You're wrong, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. I am real, and you can't take that from me. The faceless man's form began to dissolve, his edges blurring as though he were being pulled apart by an unseen force. He reached out toward her, his fingers stretching impossibly long, but they fell short. His head tilted one last time before his body collapsed into a swirl of black smoke, which was quickly drawn into the glowing fissures in the ground. As the last of the light faded and the room fell silent, Allison collapsed to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion. The oppressive cold lifted, and for the first time, she felt the air return to her lungs. Allison knelt on the cold stone floor, her body trembling as she tried to steady her breathing. The silence around her was deafening, pressing down like a weight, and the faint smell of damp earth filled her nostrils. She looked around, her vision blurry from the tears that clung to her lashes. The fissures in the floor had sealed themselves shut, leaving no trace of the blinding light or the shadows that had emerged from them. The room was still, impossibly still, as though it existed outside the flow of time. Her heart raced as she pushed herself to her feet, every muscle in her body aching. She felt hollow, as though parts of her were missing, but the spark she had clung to, the core of her identity, remained. It flickered faintly within her, a fragile ember in the darkness, but it was enough to keep her grounded. "I'm still here," she whispered, her voice hoarse and raw. "I'm still me." Her words echoed faintly in the chamber, and for a moment she allowed herself to hope that it was over. But then a sound reached her ears, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps echoing from somewhere far above. Her blood ran cold as the sound grew louder, closer, each step deliberate and measured. "No," she muttered, backing away from the center of the room. "No, no, no." She turned toward the heavy wooden door she had come through, but it was gone. The wall where it had been was now smooth, unbroken stone. Panic surged through her as she spun in circles, searching for any exit, but there was none. She was trapped. The footsteps grew louder still, and then the air shifted, carrying with it the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Allison froze, her breath catching in her throat as she felt a presence behind her. She didn't want to turn around. Every instinct screamed at her to stay still, to keep her eyes forward, but she couldn't stop herself. Slowly, trembling, she turned. He was there. The faceless man stood in the center of the room, his pale, featureless face turned toward her. His body was more distorted now, his edges flickering like a flame struggling to stay lit. But despite his unstable form, his presence was as overwhelming as ever, filling the room with an oppressive weight. "You cannot escape me," he said, his voice echoing with a hollow finality. "You cannot escape what you are." Allison backed away until her shoulders hit the wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "I beat you," she said, though her voice trembled with fear. "You were gone. I felt you disappear." "I am not so easily undone," he replied, taking a slow step forward. The ground beneath his feet seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by a falling stone. "You may resist, but it will change nothing. You are mine, and you always will be." "No!" Allison screamed, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "I won't let you take me. I won't let you." Before she could finish, the room seemed to collapse around her. The walls folded inward, the floor beneath her feet dissolving into darkness. She fell, weightless and disoriented, the air rushing past her as she plunged into the void. Her screams were swallowed by the abyss, leaving her in silence once more. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the stone chamber. She was standing in the middle of a familiar street, the street outside her apartment building. The night was quiet, the streetlights casting long shadows on the empty sidewalks. For a moment, she thought she might have dreamed it all, that the horror she had endured was nothing more than a nightmare. But then she saw him. The faceless man stood beneath a flickering streetlight, his pale, featureless face turned toward her. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his presence was undeniable. Allison's breath hitched as she took a step back, her hands trembling at her sides. "You can't be here," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real." The man tilted his head, his body flickering like a broken projection. "This is as real as you," he said, his voice carrying on the wind. "You can run, you can fight, but you cannot escape what you are." Allison turned and ran, her feet pounding against the pavement as she fled down the empty street. The world around her seemed to blur and shift, the buildings warping and stretching into unfamiliar shapes. No matter how far she ran, the street stretched endlessly ahead of her, offering no escape. And behind her, she could hear him. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, but they never faltered. No matter how fast she ran, he was always there, always just behind her. She glanced over her shoulder and saw him, his figure growing larger, closer, with every passing second. "Leave me alone," she screamed, her voice breaking with desperation. "Why won't you leave me alone?" But he didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was more chilling than any words he could have spoken. The ground beneath her feet began to crack and splinter, glowing fissures spreading outward like spiderwebs. She stumbled, falling hard onto her hands and knees. The light from the cracks was blinding now, swallowing the street and everything around it. Allison squeezed her eyes shut, her body trembling as the void threatened to consume her once more. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The world was silent. Allison opened her eyes and found herself lying on the floor of her apartment. The familiar surroundings were unchanged, as though she had never left. But the silence was oppressive, and the air felt heavy, as if the space itself was holding its breath. She sat up slowly, her heart still racing, and looked around. The apartment was empty. There was no sign of the faceless man, no sign of the glowing fissures or the shadows that had haunted her. But she didn't feel safe. She didn't feel alone. Allison sat on the floor of her apartment, her back pressed against the sofa, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. The room was quiet, eerily so, as if the entire world outside had ceased to exist. She glanced at the clock on the wall, its hands frozen at 12:17, the second hand twitching uselessly in place. The hum of the refrigerator was gone, the faint sounds of distant traffic replaced by an unsettling silence. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, which lay face down on the coffee table. She fumbled with it, her fingers clumsy, and turned it on. The screen lit up, but instead of the usual home screen, there was only static, a swirling gray void that seemed to pulse faintly, as though it were alive. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She pressed the power button, trying to turn the phone off, but it wouldn't respond. The static on the screen began to shift, shapes emerging within it, shapes that resembled a face. Or rather, the absence of one. The faceless man. The phone slipped from her hands and clattered onto the floor. She scrambled back, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as the screen continued to pulse and flicker. The static grew louder, filling the room with a distorted crackling sound that seemed to seep into her very bones. "Leave me alone," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Just leave me alone." The static abruptly stopped, plunging the room into an oppressive silence once more. Allison stared at the phone, half expecting it to spring to life again, but it lay still, the screen dark. Slowly, cautiously, she crawled toward it, her hand reaching out as if it might bite her. Before her fingers could touch the device, a soft knock echoed through the apartment. Allison froze, her heart skipping a beat. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a third knock that rattled the front door. She turned her head toward the sound, her body stiff with fear. The door seemed impossibly far away, looming at the edge of the dimly lit room like a dark portal. The knock came again, 3 sharp raps that reverberated through the silence. "Allison." The voice that followed was low and distorted, like a record played at the wrong speed. It sounded vaguely human, but there was something wrong with it, something alien and cold. "Let me in." Her throat tightened, and she shook her head even though she knew the voice couldn't see her. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Go away." The doorknob rattled, the metallic clinking sound sharp and jarring in the stillness. She pressed herself harder against the floor, her mind racing. She didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound, as if staying silent would somehow make her invisible. "Allison," the voice came again, louder this time, as though it were speaking directly into her ear. "You can't hide from me." The words sent a shiver down her spine, and she clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a sob. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at the door, her vision blurring. The shadows in the room seemed to shift and writhe, creeping closer to her like living things. The knocking stopped. For a brief moment, there was silence, and Allison allowed herself to hope that whoever, or whatever, had been at the door was gone. But then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. She watched in horror as it twisted all the way to the side, the mechanism clicking softly, and the door creaked open just a crack. Darkness spilled in from the hallway beyond, a void so complete that it seemed to absorb the faint light of the apartment. Allison couldn't see anything beyond the crack, but she could feel it, a presence, watching her from the other side. "Allison," the voice whispered her name again, softer now, almost coaxing. "Come closer." She shook her head violently, her body trembling. "No," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "I won't." The door opened wider, the darkness spilling in like liquid smoke. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form indistinct and flickering, as though it weren't fully there. It wasn't the faceless man, not exactly. It was something else, something worse. Its outline was jagged and wrong, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. It stepped into the room, its presence filling the space like a physical weight. Allison tried to crawl backward, but there was nowhere to go. The figure loomed over her, its head tilting to one side in an unnerving mimicry of curiosity. "You can't escape," it said, its voice a distorted echo. "You never could." Allison clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She could feel the spark inside her flickering again, that tiny ember of defiance that refused to be snuffed out. "You're wrong," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I'm not yours." The figure's head tilted further, the movement unnatural, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. "Then prove it," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "Show me." The room seemed to warp around her, the walls stretching and twisting as the darkness closed in. The air grew heavy, pressing against her chest, but Allison forced herself to stand. Her legs felt like jelly, and every muscle in her body screamed in protest, but she refused to give in. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, though her voice wavered. "You don't own me." The figure laughed, a sound like glass shattering, and lunged toward her. Allison stumbled backward as the figure lunged, its jagged form slicing through the air like a blade. She barely avoided its grasp, the icy chill of its presence brushing against her skin. The room warped around her, the walls dissolving into shadow and reassembling in ways that defied logic. She wasn't in her apartment anymore. She was somewhere else, somewhere between worlds, a space where nothing obeyed the rules of reality. The figure loomed before her, its flickering shape towering over her like a storm cloud. Its movements were erratic, its limbs jerking and contorting as it advanced. Allison's heart pounded in her chest, the sound deafening in the oppressive silence. She couldn't run, couldn't escape. There was nowhere to go, but she wasn't going to surrender. "You can't take me," she screamed, her voice echoing into the void. "I won't let you." The figure paused, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. "Brave words," it hissed, its voice a chorus of distorted whispers. "But you are nothing. A flicker. A shadow. You belong to me." "No!" Allison shouted, the ember within her flaring to life. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms until they drew blood. The pain grounded her, gave her focus. "I don't belong to you. I belong to me." The figure lunged again, its jagged arms outstretched, but this time Allison stood her ground. She raised her hands instinctively, and a surge of energy erupted from within her. It wasn't fire or light, nothing so tangible, but it was powerful, a force that rippled through the space around her. The figure recoiled, its form flickering violently, as if it were being torn apart. "You," it hissed, its voice faltering. "What are you?" "I'm not yours," Allison said, her voice steady despite the fear that clawed at her insides. "I never was." The shadows around her began to retreat, the oppressive darkness lifting like a veil. The warped walls of the room straightened, solidifying into the familiar contours of her apartment. The figure stumbled backward, its form collapsing inward, shrinking with every step it took. "You think you've won," it snarled, its voice a distorted echo. "But this isn't over. You cannot escape what you are." "I'll decide what I am," Allison said, her voice resolute. "And I'm not afraid of you anymore." The figure let out a guttural scream, its form disintegrating into a flurry of shadows that swirled around her before vanishing into the ether. The room fell silent once more, the air still and heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. Allison sank to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion. The spark within her was still there, glowing faintly, but it felt stronger now, more stable. She took a deep, shuddering breath and looked around. She was back in her apartment, the real one this time. The clock on the wall ticked softly, its hands moving as they should. The faint hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, grounding her in reality. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe it was over. But then she noticed the mirror. It hung on the wall across from her, its surface reflecting the dim light of the room. At first glance, it seemed normal, but as she stared, she realized something was wrong. Her reflection wasn't moving. Allison froze, her breath catching in her throat. She raised a hand slowly, and her reflection remained still, its empty eyes staring back at her. It wasn't her. It was him, the faceless man. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, this can't be." The reflection tilted its head, mimicking the jagged movements of the figure she had just banished. Its featureless face seemed to ripple, the faint outline of her own features emerging before fading again. It raised a hand, pressing it against the inside of the glass, as if trying to break through. "You thought you could escape," the reflection said, its voice low and hollow. "But you are mine. You have always been mine." Allison stumbled to her feet, backing away from the mirror. "This isn't real," she muttered, her voice trembling. "You're not real." The reflection laughed, a sound that sent chills down her spine. "Oh, but I am. I am as real as you are, and I will always be with you." "No," she said, her voice firm despite the fear that gripped her. "You don't control me. You never did." She grabbed a blanket from the sofa and threw it over the mirror, covering the faceless reflection. The room fell silent, the oppressive presence lifting slightly. But she knew it wasn't gone. Not entirely. The ember within her flickered again, stronger this time, and she clung to it like a lifeline. She didn't know what the future held or how long she could keep the darkness at bay, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not ever. Name of the next story: The Cursed Melody. Emma Harper had always loved music. It wasn't just a career for her. It was a way to connect with something larger than herself. As a music teacher at the local high school, she spent her days inspiring young minds to embrace the beauty of sound. But Emma's passion wasn't confined to her students. She often spent her evenings at home, her fingers dancing across the piano keys in her small, cozy apartment. Music was her escape, her comfort, her constant. One Friday evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the soft glow of her piano lamp filled the room, Emma sat down with a cup of tea and her favorite notebook. The week had been long, and she looked forward to unwinding with a few hours of uninterrupted playing. The soft hum of the kettle and the distant sound of cars on the street below created a soothing backdrop. Emma reached into her piano bench to retrieve some sheet music, when her fingers brushed against something unusual. She frowned, pulling out a worn envelope that she didn't remember placing there. The parchment was yellowed and brittle, the edges frayed with age. Scrawled across the front in elegant, flowing script were the words, "To the keeper of the melody." "What on earth?" Emma murmured, turning the envelope over. There was no return address, no date, nothing to indicate where it had come from or who had left it. Her curiosity piqued. She carefully opened the envelope, revealing a single sheet of music inside. The paper was unlike anything she had ever seen. The staff lines were hand-drawn, and the notes seemed to shimmer faintly as though alive. The title at the top read, "Requiem of the Fallen." Emma's brow furrowed. She had never heard of the piece before, and a quick skim of the notes revealed a complex and haunting melody, full of dissonant chords and eerie harmonies. Is this some kind of joke? She wondered aloud. She set the sheet music on the stand and positioned her hands on the keys. The first few notes were soft and somber, their sound filling the room like a whisper. But as she continued to play, the melody grew darker, more intense. A chill ran down her spine, and she hesitated, glancing around the room. It felt colder suddenly, as if a draft had slipped through an unseen crack. "Pull yourself together, Emma," she muttered, shaking her head. But when she resumed playing, the feeling of unease only deepened. The music seemed to pulse, each note resonating in her chest like a heartbeat. Shadows in the corners of the room stretched and writhed, and the soft yellow light of the piano lamp flickered. Emma stopped abruptly, her hands trembling. The room was deathly silent. Even the distant hum of traffic outside had vanished. She stood and walked to the window, peering out into the street. It was empty. Not a single car, not a single pedestrian. Just stillness. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, making her jump. She let out a nervous laugh and grabbed it, grateful for the distraction. The screen displayed a text from her best friend, Claire. "Hey, just checking in. You doing okay?" Emma quickly typed back, "Yeah, I'm fine. Just playing some music." "Strange night, though." Almost immediately, Claire replied, "What do you mean? Is something wrong?" Emma hesitated. She didn't want to sound paranoid, but the strange atmosphere was getting to her. Finally, she wrote, "Found an old piece of sheet music. It's unsettling. Probably just my imagination, though." Claire's response took a little longer this time. When it came through, it was short but unnerving. "Don't play it." Emma frowned. "Why not?" No reply. "Claire?" Emma called aloud, even though she knew it was ridiculous. Her phone remained silent, the little typing indicator absent. She tried calling, but the line went straight to voicemail. A heavy weight settled in her chest, and she turned back to the piano. The sheet music was gone. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She was certain she had left it on the stand, but now the space was empty. She checked the floor, the bench, even the envelope, but there was no sign of the mysterious composition. A faint, chilling breeze brushed against her neck, and she spun around. The room was as she had left it, yet it felt wrong, as if someone had been there and rearranged everything just slightly out of place. Her phone buzzed again, and she nearly dropped it in her haste to pick it up. But the message wasn't from Claire. It was from an unknown number. "The melody is incomplete. Finish it." Emma stared at the screen, her blood turning to ice. Her hands shook as she typed back, "Who is this? What do you want?" The response came almost instantly. "Play it." She threw the phone onto the couch and backed away, her heart hammering in her chest. "This isn't happening," she whispered. "This can't be real." But then the piano began to play. The first notes were soft, tentative, as though the keys were being pressed by an invisible hand. Emma froze, unable to move, as the haunting melody filled the room. The shadows returned, crawling up the walls like living things. And then she saw them. Figures, pale, translucent, and flickering like candlelight, emerged from the darkness. They hovered just at the edges of her vision, their hollow eyes fixed on her. Their mouths moved silently, as if whispering words she couldn't hear. "No," Emma said, her voice shaking. "This isn't real. This isn't happening." One of the figures stepped closer, its face inches from hers. Its mouth opened, and a raspy voice whispered, "Finish the melody." "I don't know how," Emma cried. "I don't even know what this is." The figure tilted its head, its hollow eyes unblinking. "You are the keeper. You must complete what was begun." Before she could respond, the room erupted in a cacophony of sound. The piano keys slammed down in chaotic, dissonant chords, and the shadows twisted violently. The figures circled her, their whispers growing louder and more insistent. "Finish it! Finish it! Finish it!" Emma clapped her hands over her ears, but it was no use. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside her head, a relentless, pounding command. She stumbled back to the piano, her legs weak beneath her. "Okay," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'll play. I'll finish it." She sat down and placed her hands on the keys. The figures stilled, their hollow eyes watching her intently. The sheet music reappeared before her, the notes shimmering faintly. Her hands moved almost of their own accord, guided by an unseen force. The melody unfolded, growing more complex and otherworldly with each passing moment. The figures began to change. Their translucent forms solidified, their hollow eyes filling with light. But their expressions remained haunting, a mix of sorrow and rage. One by one, they began to sing, their voices melding with the music in a chilling harmony. Emma felt their pain, their longing, their anger. It poured into her, overwhelming her senses. She played on, tears blurring her vision. The melody reached its climax, a series of piercing, dissonant chords that reverberated through the room. The figures screamed, their voices rising in a deafening crescendo. And then silence. Emma slumped over the keys, her body trembling. The room was empty. The figures were gone. The sheet music lay before her, its notes fading until the page was blank. Her phone buzzed once more. "Thank you." Emma stared at the phone screen, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The text was from the same unknown number as before. She didn't want to respond, didn't want to interact with whatever entity had pulled her into this nightmare. Her fingers hovered over the screen, trembling, before she finally tossed the phone onto the couch. "I'm done," she muttered, her voice shaking. "This is over." But as the words left her mouth, the piano let out a single, sharp note. Emma's head snapped toward it, her heart pounding. The room, which had seemed calm moments ago, suddenly felt suffocating again. Shadows crept back into the corners, and the air grew colder. She clenched her fists, trying to steady herself. "No," she said, louder this time, as though speaking to the room itself. "I'm not playing anymore. I don't care what you want." The piano answered her defiance with another note, this one louder, more jarring. It was as if the instrument was mocking her, daring her to defy it further. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she backed away slowly. Her foot caught the edge of the coffee table, and she nearly tripped. The room felt alive, like it was breathing, shifting, waiting. Emma grabbed her phone, scrolling frantically through her contacts until she found Claire's number. She hit call and pressed the phone to her ear, praying her friend would answer this time. The line rang once, twice, then clicked. "Emma." Claire's voice was groggy, like she'd just woken up. "What's going on? Are you okay?" Emma nearly broke down at the sound of her friend's voice. "Claire," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Something's happening. There's this music, this sheet music, and I think it's cursed or something. I played it, and now—" "Wait," Claire interrupted, her tone sharp. "You played it?" "Emma, I told you not to play it. I didn't know what else to do." Emma cried. It felt like I had to. But now it won't stop. The piano, the shadows, these things, they won't leave me alone." Claire was silent for a moment, and Emma could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. Finally, Claire said, "Where did you find it?" "The music, "In my piano bench," Emma said. "I don't know how it got there. It was in this old envelope addressed to the keeper of the melody." "Claire, what's happening to me?" Another pause. Then Claire's voice, low and serious. "Emma, listen to me. You need to get out of your apartment. Right now. Leave everything behind, especially that sheet music. Just go." Emma's stomach dropped. "Why? What do you know about this?" "I'll explain later," Claire said. "Just trust me. You're not safe there." Before Emma could respond, the line went dead. She stared at her phone in disbelief. The screen showing the call had ended. Her fingers fumbled as she tried to call Claire back, but the call wouldn't go through. The phone's signal indicator blinked red, no service. A loud crash echoed from the piano, and Emma screamed, dropping the phone. She turned to see the sheet music, which she'd been certain had gone blank, now back on the stand. But it wasn't the same. The notes were different, darker, the melody more chaotic. It seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the ink shifting and twisting as though alive. "I'm not doing this," Emma said, backing toward the door. Her hands shook as she reached for her coat and keys, her mind racing with Claire's warning. She didn't care where she went, she just needed to get out. But as she grabbed the doorknob, an icy force stopped her in her tracks. Her hand refused to turn the handle, as if something unseen was holding it in place. The room grew colder, and a deep, guttural voice echoed behind her. "You cannot leave." Emma spun around, her back pressed against the door. The room was no longer just her apartment. It had transformed into something unrecognizable. The walls seemed to stretch and warp, the shadows moving like liquid. The figures were back, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They surrounded the piano, their mouths open in a silent, collective scream. "What do you want from me?" Emma shouted, tears streaming down her face. "Why are you doing this?" One of the figures stepped forward, its form more solid than the others. Its face was still pale and featureless, but it seemed to radiate an aura of authority. When it spoke, its voice was a low, guttural growl. "You must complete the melody," it said. "Only then will we be free." Emma shook her head violently. "I already played it. I finished it. What more do you want?" "The melody was not complete," the figure said. "It cannot be finished by mortal hands alone." The words sent a chill down Emma's spine. She felt as though the air had been sucked from the room, leaving her gasping for breath. "I don't understand," she said weakly. "What do you mean?" The figure raised a hand, pointing toward the piano. "You are the keeper. It is your burden. Your fate." Emma's knees buckled, and she slid to the floor. She couldn't take her eyes off the piano, its keys gleaming like teeth in the dim light. The sheet music seemed to call to her, the notes shifting and rearranging themselves in an endless loop. She felt the pull again, the irresistible urge to sit down and play. But this time she fought it. "No," she whispered. "I won't do it. I won't." The figure's hollow eyes seemed to bore into her soul. "You cannot resist. The melody is part of you now. To deny it is to deny your existence." Emma's heart raced as the shadows closed in around her. The figures moved closer, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. She clutched her head, trying to block out the sound, but it was everywhere, inside her, consuming her. And then, as if guided by some unseen force, she found herself back at the piano. Her hands trembled as they hovered over the keys. The figures surrounded her, their glowing eyes watching intently. The sheet music lay before her, the notes shimmering like stars. Emma took a deep breath, her fingers pressing down on the first chord. The sound echoed through the room, resonating deep within her chest. The figures began to sing again, their voices blending with the melody in a haunting harmony. As the music unfolded, Emma felt a strange sense of clarity. The melody was no longer just a series of notes. It was a story, a memory, a plea. The figures weren't just spirits. They were fragments of something much older, much darker. And as the final notes hung in the air, Emma realized the truth. The final notes lingered in the air like a whisper, soft yet impossibly heavy. Emma sat frozen at the piano, her hands still hovering over the keys. The shadows around her grew still, their restless shifting replaced by an oppressive silence. She wanted to believe it was over, that finishing the melody had broken whatever curse bound her to this nightmare. But deep down she knew better. The air in the room still crackled with tension, and the oppressive weight in her chest hadn't lifted. Something was unfinished. "Is that it?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "I played it. You said it would set you free." The lead figure stepped forward, its hollow face tilting toward her. "The melody is not complete," it said, its voice echoing like a distant thunderclap. Emma's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "I played every note, exactly as it's written. What more do you want from me?" The figure's glowing eyes flickered, and its head tilted in an almost pitying gesture. "The melody is incomplete because you do not yet understand it. To finish it, you must become one with it. Only then will it be whole." The cryptic words made Emma's head spin. She tried to stand, to get away from the piano, but her legs refused to move. It was as if the chair beneath her had become part of her body, holding her in place. Panic surged through her veins as the figures began to chant in low, guttural tones. The sound vibrated in her bones, a deep resonance that seemed to unravel her thoughts. "What does that even mean?" Emma shouted, her voice cracking. "How am I supposed to become one with a melody? I don't understand." The figure raised a pale, featureless hand and pointed toward the sheet music. The notes had changed again, twisting and reforming into something entirely new. They no longer followed the neat lines and spaces of the staff. Instead, they spiraled outward, chaotic and unbound. The symbols looked ancient, otherworldly, and just staring at them made Emma's vision blur. "You must surrender," the figure said. "Play not with your hands, but with your soul." Emma's heart pounded as the meaning of its words sank in. "You're asking me to give up who I am," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "To become one of you." The figure didn't answer, but its silence was enough. The shadows pressed closer, their whispers filling her ears with fragments of words she couldn't understand. The melody seemed to hum in the air, vibrating with an unrelenting pull that grew stronger with every passing second. "I don't want this," Emma said, her voice trembling. "I didn't ask for this. I just wanted to play music, to teach, to live a normal life." The figure's voice was cold, devoid of sympathy. "The keeper does not choose. The keeper is chosen." Tears streamed down Emma's face as she fought against the invisible force holding her in place. She gripped the edges of the piano bench, her nails digging into the wood. "Please," she begged. "There has to be another way." The chanting grew louder, the shadows swirling around her like a storm. The other figures raised their hands, their hollow faces glowing brighter. The room seemed to dissolve into darkness, the walls and furniture melting away until there was nothing left but Emma, the piano, and the endless void. "Finish the melody," the lead figure commanded, its voice reverberating through the emptiness. "Or be consumed by it." Emma's hands trembled as they hovered over the keys once more. The pull was unbearable now, an ache deep in her chest that felt like it would tear her apart. She wanted to resist, to fight, but the truth was she didn't have a choice. The melody had taken hold of her, and it wouldn't let go until it was finished. Her fingers pressed down on the keys, and the music that poured forth was unlike anything she'd ever played before. It was raw and primal, a sound that seemed to come not from the piano, but from the depths of her own soul. The figures began to sing again, their voices rising in a haunting harmony that sent chills down her spine. As the melody unfolded, Emma felt herself slipping away. Memories flashed before her eyes, her childhood, her parents, the first time she'd ever touched a piano. She saw herself teaching her students, laughing with Claire, walking through the park on sunny afternoons. Each memory faded into darkness, replaced by the swirling chaos of the music. "No," Emma whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I don't want to forget. I don't want to lose myself, but the melody was relentless. It pulled her deeper and deeper, stripping away everything she was until all that remained was the music. Her hands moved faster, the notes flowing from her in an unstoppable tide. The figures chanting reached a fever pitch, their voices blending with the melody in a symphony of anguish and despair. And then, with one final shattering chord, it was over. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma sat frozen at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys. The figures were gone, the shadows dissolved. The room had returned to its normal state, as though nothing had happened. But Emma knew better. She could feel it, the emptiness, the void where her soul had once been. Slowly, she stood and turned toward the door. Her reflection in the mirror caught her eye, and she froze. The face staring back at her was not her own. It was pale and featureless, with glowing eyes that burned like embers. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The silence was absolute, and that's the end of tonight's stories. Keep listening to the sound of rain and fall into a deep, peaceful sleep. Sweet dreams.